Hello, and welcome to the quiet dark. I'm glad you found your way here. As you settle in, and as my voice becomes a part of the silence in your room, I'd love for you to leave a comment with the time it is for you and the city or country you're listening from. I find it comforting to imagine this web of listeners, all of us connected for a little while in the shared darkness, waiting for a story. And if you find comfort here too, a simple like and a subscription helps our small community of night owls grow. Now get comfortable. Let the world outside fade away. It's time for our stories to begin. First story: The Man Who Tends the Black Roses. The house on Primrose Lane was, in Sarah's estimation, perfect. Not in the grand, opulent way that shouted for attention, but in the soft, welcoming manner of a cherished memory. It was a modest 2-story, painted a cheerful buttercup yellow, with a porch swing that invited lingering and window boxes spilling over with vibrant petunias. The street itself was a postcard of suburban bliss. Ancient oak trees laced their branches together overhead, creating a dappled canopy that filtered the sunlight into dancing patterns on the neatly manicured lawns. Children's laughter, bright and clear, often echoed from a nearby park, and the air frequently carried the sweet, earthy scent of freshly cut grass, mingled with the faint perfume of blooming hydrangeas. It was the kind of place where dreams of picket fences and Sunday barbecues could finally take root, a haven from the relentless hum of the city she had left behind. Sarah had arrived in early spring, just as the world was shaking off winter's gray shroud, and the neighborhood had greeted her with an almost theatrical explosion of color. Forsythia bushes blazed with golden fire. Tulips stood in proud, soldiers-like rows, and the cherry blossoms along the sidewalk unfurled their delicate pink petals in a silent, joyful celebration. Each morning, she would sip her coffee on the porch swing, watching the world awaken, a profound sense of peace settling deep within her. The quiet hum of lawnmowers, the distant bark of a friendly dog, the easy wave from passing neighbors, it all woven into a tapestry of domestic contentment she hadn't known she craved, until it enveloped her. There was, however, one small exception to this idyllic portrait, a single, intriguing brushstroke that diverged from the otherwise harmonious scene. It was her next-door neighbor, a man who lived in the house directly to her left. The house itself was similar in structure to her own, perhaps a shade older, with dark green shutters that always remained closed, even on the sunniest days. But it was not the house that drew Sarah's attention. It was the garden, and the man who tended it. He was an old man, though it was difficult to gauge his exact age. His movements were slow, deliberate, almost balletic, despite a stoop that hinted at years of bending over earth. His silver hair was meticulously combed, and he always wore the same simple, dark trousers and a crisp, long-sleeved shirt, regardless of the weather. What struck Sarah most about him was his profound silence. In the week she had lived there, she had never once heard his voice. He would emerge from his house at dawn, sometimes before, and return only after dusk had swallowed the last vestiges of twilight. He worked tirelessly, methodically, his gaze fixed solely on the earth before him. And his garden. Ah, his garden was the focal point, the stark counterpoint to every other blooming thing on Primrose Lane. For instead of the riot of reds, yellows, and purples that adorned every other plot, his garden was a deep, uncompromising black. He grew roses exclusively, and every single one was a shade of profound, velvety midnight. They were not merely dark red or deep purple, but truly, impossibly black. Their petals were so dense with color that they seemed to absorb all light, creating a void, a tiny, exquisite black hole in the heart of the vibrant street. They were beautiful in a stark, unsettling way, their perfect, tightly furled buds slowly unfurling into large, opulent blooms that seemed to drink the light around them. The old man tended them with an almost reverential care, his thin fingers stroking their leaves, his posture conveying an unspoken devotion to these unusual, somber flowers. He would prune them with delicate, precise snips, water them from a gleaming copper watering can, and even, Sarah observed one evening, seemed to whisper to them in the fading light, though no sound ever reached her ears. At first, Sarah found his silent dedication merely eccentric, a charmingly odd detail in her otherwise conventional new life. She sometimes wondered where he sourced such unusual specimens, or what drove him to cultivate only these funerary blooms. She even considered approaching him, offering a friendly greeting, but his intense focus, his almost impenetrable aura of quietude, always deterred her. He seemed to exist in his own separate sphere, bound only to his black roses. Then, the subtle changes began. They were so faint at first that Sarah dismissed them as tricks of the light, or perhaps her own imagination, playing games in the quiet solitude of her new home. It started with the colors. The cheerful buttercup yellow of her house seemed, on certain mornings, a little less vibrant, as if a fine layer of dust had settled over it. The fiery forsythia across the street, which had burned so brightly, now appeared a touch muted, its gold tinged with an almost sickly pale green. Sarah attributed it to the changing angle of the sun, or perhaps a slight haze in the air. But the phenomenon persisted, growing, deepening. The rich emerald green of her lawn began to soften, taking on a curious, desaturated quality, like a photograph slowly losing its pigment. The bright reds of her petunias seemed to bleed into a dull, rusty brown at their edges. The cherry blossoms, which should have been at their peak, began to drop their petals with an alarming rapidity. Not a gentle drift, but a sudden, almost violent shedding, leaving the trees looking stark and skeletal against the spring sky. And all the while, the old man's black roses thrived. Each day, another bud would unfurl, another velvety black blossom would open, reaching out, it seemed, into the very air. They seemed to grow larger, darker, more intensely black with each passing day, their shadows deepening, even in bright sunlight. Next came the sounds. The vibrant symphony of Primrose Lane began to falter. The boisterous laughter of children from the park grew softer, more distant, eventually fading into a hushed murmur that barely reached her ears. The enthusiastic barks of the neighborhood dogs became infrequent, whimpering, or simply ceased altogether. The cheerful chirping of sparrows and robins, once a constant melody in the mornings, became intermittent, then sporadic, until only an occasional, faint cheep broke the profound silence. Even the comforting drone of lawnmowers, once a staple of weekend afternoons, grew less frequent, their engines sounding weary, as if struggling to produce their familiar roar. The silence was not peaceful. It was oppressive, a heavy blanket that muffled not only sound, but also the very spirit of the neighborhood. Sarah found herself holding her breath more often, straining to hear the familiar sounds she had once taken for granted. The absence was chilling, a void where life had once resonated. She noticed her neighbors, too. They walked with a slower, more listless gait, their shoulders slightly slumped. Their once friendly waves became tentative nods, their smiles, once warm, faded into neutral expressions. Their conversations, if they had any, were conducted in hushed tones, almost whispers. It was as if a subtle, invisible drain was at work, siphoning away their vitality, leaving them muted, like old photographs bleached by time. The connection became impossible to ignore. Each time Sarah stepped onto her porch, her gaze was drawn to the old man's garden. The black roses, now fully mature, were a sight of terrifying beauty. Their petals, unfurled to their full, almost unnatural size, were like velvet shadows cast upon the earth. The air around them seemed colder, denser, a small pocket of absolute stillness in an already quiet world. And every time a new bud blossomed, or an existing flower grew just a fraction larger, Sarah noticed another shift. The green of her oak tree would dull a little more. The blue of the sky would lose some of its intensity. The faint sound of the wind chimes down the street would fade another notch. It was as if the roses were not merely absorbing light, but the very essence of life, drinking the world dry, one hue, one sound, one spark of vibrancy at a time. A gnawing fear began to take root in Sarah's heart, a chilling certainty that went beyond mere superstition. She tried to rationalize it, to find logical explanations for the gradual desiccation of her perfect street. Perhaps it was a strange, localized drought, though the air remained humid and the ground wasn't parched. Perhaps a peculiar blight had swept through, affecting both flora and fauna, and even, it seemed, the human spirit. But deep down, she knew. She felt it with an unsettling certainty that clawed at her composure. It was the black roses. One evening, as the last vestiges of daylight bled from the sky, painting the clouds in sickly gray and dull lavender hues, Sarah watched the old man from her living room window. He was standing amidst his roses, his back to her, his posture strangely rigid. The roses themselves seemed to pulse with an unseen energy, their blackness more profound than ever, drinking the faint remaining light until the world outside her window seemed to be rendered in shades of charcoal and ash. A profound silence had fallen over Primrose Lane, a silence so complete it pressed against her ears, making them ache. There were no crickets, no distant traffic, no rustle of leaves. Nothing but the heavy, expectant quiet. Suddenly, a single, exquisite black rose, one that had been a tightly closed bud that morning, unfurled with a slow, deliberate grace. Its petals peeled back, one by one, revealing a heart of profound, inky darkness. As it reached its full bloom, Sarah felt a shiver run through her, not from cold, but from a deeper, more primal fear. She looked around her living room. The vibrant red of her favorite throw blanket seemed dull, almost brown. The cheerful yellow of her walls now appeared a pale, sickly cream. Even the sound of her own breathing seemed muffled, distant. Panic, cold and sharp, began to prick at her. She had to do something. She had to break this spell, this creeping decay that was consuming her new home, her new life. She had to confront the source. With a desperate resolve, she pushed herself from her chair, her legs feeling heavy, as if a strange lethargy had settled into her very bones. She walked to the front door, her hand trembling as she reached for the doorknob. The porch light, usually a warm, welcoming glow, now cast a faint, yellowed light, barely illuminating the steps. She stepped out into the oppressive quiet of the evening. The air was still, heavy, and strangely scentless. Her eyes immediately went to the old man's garden. He was still there, standing perfectly still, facing his roses. He did not turn, did not acknowledge her presence. The black roses, countless now, seemed to writhe and undulate in the dim light, their darkness so absolute it seemed to consume the very concept of shadow. They were not merely black. They were an absence of color, a gaping hole in the visual spectrum, each petal a silent, hungry mouth. Sarah took a step forward, then another, compelled by a mixture of terror and a desperate need for answers. The grass beneath her feet felt brittle, lifeless. The vibrant petunias in her window boxes, once so full of life, hung limp and withered, their color almost entirely drained away, leaving behind a pale, ghostly husk. She could feel the world around her dimming, not just visually, but experientially. Her own senses seemed to be fading, her hearing dulling, the world becoming muted, distant, like a dream that was slowly slipping away. "Sir?" Her voice was a mere whisper, thin and reedy, startling even herself in the profound silence. It felt alien, like a sound from another world. The old man remained still, a statue carved from shadow. "Excuse me," she tried again, a little louder, though her throat felt constricted, as if the silence itself was choking her. "Your roses, they're beautiful, but..." She trailed off, unsure how to voice the terrifying suspicion that had taken root in her mind. How could she tell him that his exquisite flowers were draining the life from their world? That they were not merely plants, but conduits of some insidious, unseen force? Slowly, agonizingly slowly, the old man turned his head. His eyes, when they met hers, were not human. Or rather, they were human, but they held no light, no discernible color. They were simply dark, fathomless pools, reflecting the absolute blackness of his roses. There was no malice in them, no anger, no curiosity, only an immense, bottomless emptiness. A chilling realization washed over Sarah. Colder than any dread she had yet known, the old man wasn't tending the black roses. He was merely a part of them. He was not their gardener, but their keeper, their extension, the final decaying link in a chain that stretched from the heart of the deepest darkness into the once bright heart of Primrose Lane. He had faded along with the street, along with the color and the sound, until he was nothing more than a living shadow, a silent, empty vessel for the insatiable hunger of his impossible blooms. As the last flicker of light seemed to drain from the sky, swallowed by the profound, blossoming darkness of the roses, Sarah felt a profound, chilling lethargy settle over her. Her vibrant yellow house was now a dull, sickly gray. The bright green lawn was a faded, lifeless brown. The laughter of children was a memory, a ghost of a sound that no longer belonged here. Even the scent of fresh-cut grass, once so comforting, was gone, replaced by a strange, metallic tang, a whisper of something cold and ancient. Her vision began to blur, the world around her softening, losing its edges. The once vibrant colors of her own dress seemed to leach away. Her skin felt cool and pale, as if her own vitality was ebbing, drawn into the silent, hungry maw of the black flowers. She looked at her hands, and they seemed translucent, ethereal, almost as if she were dissolving. The old man his dark eyes still fixed on her, raised a skeletal hand, not in greeting, but in a slow, deliberate gesture towards his garden. And as he did, one more bud, nestled deep within the thorny embrace of a particularly large, dark rosebush, began to unfurl. It pulsed, blacker than anything Sarah had ever witnessed, its petals slowly, beautifully, majestically opening to reveal a core of pure, unadulterated void. And in that moment, Sarah understood. The roses were not merely beautiful. They were beautiful because they consumed. And they would consume everything until nothing was left but the profound, exquisite silence of their eternal bloom. Her own senses were now but faint echoes. The world was fading, fading, and the black roses were blooming, blooming, drinking everything, until there was only the darkness. Second story, the Somnus Protocol. Arthur had always been a man acquainted with the long, cold nights. Insomnia was not merely a condition for him. It was a companion, a persistent shadow stretching across hours that should have been dedicated to restorative slumber. He knew the precise texture of his ceiling at 3 a.m, the way the street lights painted patterns on his wall, the rhythmic drip of a leaky faucet from 2 floors below. His days were a hazy landscape of fatigue, his thoughts perpetually cloaked in a fine, almost imperceptible mist. He had tried everything: warm milk, meditation apps, herbal teas, even the heavy chemical embrace of prescription pills that left him feeling drugged rather than rested. Nothing offered true respite. Then came the advertisement, a sleek, minimalist banner that appeared on his tablet screen, promising not just sleep, but a revolution in rest. Somnus Protocol, it was called, an app that claimed to not only track sleep cycles with unparalleled precision, but to actively sculpt the very fabric of one's dreams using subtle auditory pulses. It sounded like science fiction, too good to be true, a balm for the eternally restless. Yet Arthur, desperate and weary, downloaded it. The initial setup was simple, almost deceptively so. He calibrated it, selected a general dream theme. He chose serene landscapes, and placed his phone on his nightstand, the device now a silent sentinel of his nightly pilgrimage into the unknown. That first night was different. He drifted off with an unusual swiftness, a gentle easing into darkness he hadn't experienced in years. And then, the dreams began. They were not merely dreams. They were experiences. He walked through fields of lavender, under a sky painted with hues of rose and gold, the scent so real he could almost taste it. He soared above snow-capped peaks, the wind a tangible caress against his dream skin. He sat by a pristine lake, the water so clear he could see every pebble on its bed, and a kindly old woman with eyes like polished amber offered him a cup of steaming tea. Every detail was hyper-realistic, every sensation vivid. He awoke feeling profoundly rested, a sensation so foreign it almost startled him. The mist had lifted from his mind. He felt sharp, invigorated, like a new man. Night after night, the Somnus Protocol delivered. His dreams became his private masterpiece, meticulously crafted narratives filled with joy, wonder, and an almost tactile sense of peace. The lavender fields returned, but now they stretched endlessly, leading to hidden groves where mythical creatures, gentle and shimmering, grazed under twilight skies. The old woman by the lake became a recurring presence, her wisdom dispensed in soft, comforting tones. He met a young, vibrant artist with laughter like wind chimes, who painted fantastical murals on the sides of ancient, crumbling castles. These dream figures were so real, so vivid, that he often thought of them throughout his day, fondly recalling their face, their voices, their serene presences. His waking life began to transform. With consistent, profound sleep, his energy levels soared, his focus at work sharpened, his creativity bloomed, and the perpetual frown that had etched itself between his brows slowly faded. He became more sociable, more engaged. People noticed. "You look amazing, Arthur," his colleagues would say. "What's your secret?" He would just smile vaguely, a knowing warmth in his chest. His secret was Somnus Protocol, his nightly architect of euphoria. He felt a quiet superiority, possessing a key to a dimension of perfect rest that others could only dimly imagine. He checked the app religiously, ensuring it was active, that the subtle pulses were emitting, that his nightly journey into perfection was secured. Yet a subtle shift began to occur, a barely perceptible ripple in the placid waters of his newfound serenity. The dreams, while still beautiful, started to feel prescriptive, less like spontaneous creations, and more like meticulously replayed scenarios. The old woman's advice, while comforting, was often a repetition of previous nights. The young artist's murals, though stunning, seemed to follow a predictable pattern. And the faces, the beautiful, kind faces of his dream companions, began to feel less like beloved characters, and more like actors. Highly convincing ones, but actors nonetheless. He dismissed it as overthinking, a minor glitch in his otherwise perfect routine. Perhaps his brain was simply getting accustomed to the dream shaping, creating a comfortable familiarity. He didn't want to question the magic. He was finally sleeping, truly sleeping. And that was paramount. Then came the first tremor, a jolt that went deeper than mere fatigue. He was walking to his usual coffee shop, the morning sun glinting off the pavement, when he saw her. Standing by the newsstand, her head tilted slightly, a small, knowing smile playing on her lips. It was the young artist from his dreams, her vibrant red hair swept back by an invisible breeze, her distinctive paint-splattered jeans, even the way she held a small, leather-bound sketchbook. It was all identical. His breath hitched. He stopped mid-stride, his coffee order forgotten. She didn't seem to notice him, lost in thought as she gazed at a magazine cover. He blinked hard. When he opened his eyes, she was gone. He shook his head, a dry, humorless laugh escaping his lips. Exhaustion, he muttered to himself, or wishful thinking. He was obsessed with his dreams. It was only natural his mind would play tricks on him. He went about his day, but the image of her face, so vividly real, clung to the edges of his consciousness. The sightings became more frequent, more undeniable. The kindly old woman, with the amber eyes, standing in line at the grocery store, patiently waiting her turn, a wicker basket clutched in her hand. Arthur froze, staring. Her gaze drifted over, met his, and for a fleeting moment, her expression seemed to shift, a flicker of something ancient and knowing in those amber depths before she looked away. He ducked behind a stack of cereal boxes, his heart hammering against his ribs. It was irrational, impossible, yet the resemblance was too striking to be a mere coincidence. He saw the gentle, shimmering creatures of the lavender fields too, or at least people who bore their distinctive gait, their ethereal grace. They would pass him on the street, always just beyond reach, their eyes, when they occasionally met his, holding an unnerving blankness, a depthless familiarity that sent shivers down his spine. They never spoke, never acknowledged him directly, but their presence was a cold, quiet dread that began to seep into his waking hours. He tried to ignore it, to rationalize it away. Maybe he was just more observant now, noticing the vast array of faces in the city, finding coincidences. But the feeling persisted, a growing certainty that these were not random strangers. They were too distinct, too familiar, too perfectly rendered in the landscapes of his sleep. One evening, consumed by a gnawing anxiety, he decided to skip the Somnus Protocol. He would break the cycle, clear his head, prove to himself that this was all a figment of his overactive imagination. He lay in bed, the silence of his room oppressive, listening to the familiar sounds of the night. But sleep wouldn't come. Hours stretched into an eternity. And when he finally did drift off, his dreams were a terrifying cacophony, twisted versions of his serene landscapes, populated by grotesque parodies of his dream companions. The lavender fields became a thorny wasteland. The old woman's face contorted into a malevolent mask, her amber eyes burning with an accusatory light. The young artist shrieked at him, her paintbrush dripping black tar. He woke up in a cold sweat, gasping, the terror more real than any nightmare he had ever experienced. Shaking, he reached for his phone and reactivated the Somnus Protocol. He needed the quiet perfection, the controlled narratives. He needed to escape the horror of his own untamed mind. He fell into a deep, dreamless sleep, the app's subtle pulses once again guiding him into a structured oblivion. He woke up feeling refreshed, the nightmare a distant, fading echo. He told himself it was withdrawal, his brain reacting violently to the sudden absence of the app's calming influence. But the encounters in the waking world intensified. They were no longer fleeting glimpses. They began to appear in places he frequented: the small park where he ate lunch, the bookstore he browsed on weekends, even the bus stop he used every morning. They would stand slightly apart, observing him, not overtly, not threateningly, but with an unnerving stillness, their gazes like invisible threads, pulling at his sanity. Their eyes were the most disturbing feature, a familiar emptiness, a serene vacancy that echoed the peaceful blankness of his dream characters. They weren't just looking, they were recognizing. He saw the artist again, this time sitting on a bench in the park. She wasn't sketching, just watching him as he ate his sandwich. He tried to look away, to pretend he hadn't seen her, but he felt her gaze, a cool, unblinking presence on his skin. He stood up abruptly, his half-eaten lunch forgotten, and practically ran from the park. The next day, the old woman with the amber eyes was waiting by the entrance to his apartment building. She was just standing there, her hands clasped in front of her, her face serene, eyes fixed on him as he approached. He felt a cold dread seize him. He wanted to scream, to run, but his feet were rooted to the spot. As he fumbled with his keys, her lips parted slightly. He heard no sound, but a voice, calm and ancient, seemed to echo in his mind. "You brought us here, Arthur. We are home." His breath hitched. He managed to yank open the door and stumble inside, slamming it shut and leaning against it, heart pounding like a drum. He was hallucinating. He had to be. This was the result of sleep deprivation, or too much sleep. Or the app was slowly unraveling his mind, He opened the Somnus Protocol app, his fingers trembling. He wanted answers. He scrolled through the settings, looking for anything, any hidden clause, any explanation. He found a small, almost invisible link at the very bottom of the terms and conditions, a hyperlink labeled Dream Resonance Theory. He tapped it. The page loaded slowly, revealing dense, academic-sounding text. It spoke of a new frontier in neuroscience, of a revolutionary discovery, that collective unconscious archetypes could, with the right frequency and sustained exposure, be coaxed into a state of wakeful resonance. It described how the auditory pulses weren't just shaping dreams. They were acting as conduits, drawing these archetypes, the dream figures, the landscapes, the very essence of the imagined world, closer to a tangible reality. The more vivid the dream, the more consistently a figure appeared, the stronger the resonance. A horrifying realization dawned on him. He hadn't just been dreaming these people, he had been pulling them into existence. His perfect dreams weren't just mental constructs, they were incubators. He had spent months diligently nurturing these entities, giving them form and substance, inviting them across the threshold from the ethereal to the corporeal. The blankness in their eyes, the familiar emptiness, was because they weren't individuals. They were reflections, echoes given form. He scrolled further, his blood turning to ice. The theory concluded with a chilling hypothesis. Prolonged exposure, or an especially potent resonance event, could lead to full materialization. And with full materialization, the barrier between dream and reality would not merely thin, but dissolve entirely. And the dream figures would not just be observers, participants. He looked around his apartment, suddenly feeling incredibly vulnerable. The old woman's voice, silent, yet echoing in his mind. "We are home." He had to stop it. He went back to the app's main screen, looking for a way to delete his account, to uninstall, to sever the connection. There was no easy option. He tried to force close the app, to even turn off his phone, but the screen flickered, a message appearing in an elegant, flowing script. The Somnus Protocol is now an integral part of your neural network. Disruption may cause unforeseen and potentially irreversible cognitive restructuring. Your dreams are our reality. Welcome home. He screamed, a raw, primal sound, and threw his phone across the room. It hit the wall with a dull thud, the screen shattering. But even as it lay broken, a faint, rhythmic pulse seemed to emanate from it. A silent, persistent hum that vibrated through the floorboards, through the very air. That night, he didn't even attempt to sleep. He huddled in his living room, lights blazing, staring at the shattered phone, as if it held some malevolent power. But the pulses didn't need the screen. They were already embedded. He could feel them, a subtle vibration behind his eyes, a gentle thrumming deep within his brain. As the pre-dawn light began to filter through his curtains, he heard a faint scratching at his apartment door, a soft, insistent rhythm. He held his breath, his heart threatening to burst from his chest. The scratching continued, followed by a soft, almost imperceptible murmur. He knew that voice. It was the young artist, her wind chime laughter now laced with something far more sinister, something knowing and ancient. He tiptoed to the peephole. On the other side, illuminated by the dim hallway light, stood a crowd. Not just the artist, or the old woman, or the shimmering figures. Every single face, Every single form he had ever conjured or encountered in his perfect dreams was standing there, silent, expectant. Their eyes, all of them, bore the same blank, familiar emptiness, now tinged with a predatory hunger. They weren't just observing anymore. They were waiting. And then, one of them, a tall, gaunt figure he recognized as the silent guardian of his most serene dream lakes, slowly raised a hand. His long, slender fingers gently tapped the door. Once, twice, 3 times. A knock. A very real, very physical knock. Arthur stumbled backward, knocking over a lamp. The sound echoed in the terrifying silence. He looked around his apartment, the familiar walls suddenly seeming to press in on him, no longer a sanctuary, but a cage. His perfect dreams had become his perfect nightmare, and the figures he had so lovingly nurtured were now standing on his doorstep, patiently waiting for him to open the door and invite them fully into his waking world. He was tired, so terribly tired, and he knew, with a certainty colder than any night, that he would never truly sleep again. The Somnus Protocol had delivered on its promise. It had shaped his dreams, but in doing so, it had reshaped his reality forever. Third story, The Lanternist's Lament. The salt-chapped pages, brittle with age and damp from decades of sea spray, crackled under my fingertips. The ink, faded to a sepia whisper, told a tale I was only just beginning to understand. I, Thomas Blackwood, had arrived at the Godsend Light on October 17th, 1892, a fresh face to the solitude, eager for the quiet discipline of the isolated tower. My predecessor, a man named Elias Thorne, had, according to the official reports, succumbed to a severe melancholic disposition, culminating in a regrettable incident. They found him, or what remained of him, at the base of the rock, dashed against the barnacled stones, a final desperate leap into the churning abyss. The incident was ruled a tragic accident, a consequence of the crushing loneliness that often claimed men in such desolate posts. But the logbook, tucked away beneath a loose floorboard in Elias's old quarters, whispered a different truth. It was his personal journal, an unfiltered chronicle of his final months, detailing a slow, creeping erosion of his mind. I had found it quite by chance, while inspecting the worn planks for rot, a morbid curiosity guiding my hand as I dislodged the board. The entries began innocuously enough. Observations on the weather, notes on the lamp, mundane details of a solitary existence. But as I read deeper, a chill, colder than any North Atlantic gale, began to seep into my bones. Elias's descent, it seemed, was not into mere melancholia, but into something far more specific, far more terrifying. His early entries spoke of restless nights, of an inability to truly find peace even in the rhythmic hum of the great lens. He mentioned shadows in the periphery, tricks of the light, the usual companions of isolation. I dismissed them at first as the common anxieties of a man alone, but then the tone shifted. The first hint of the true horror appeared on April 3rd, 1891. Another night. The beam cuts through the fog, as it always does. But tonight, it illuminates more than just the shifting mists. A flicker, on the very edge of the horizon, a shape, impossible to discern, yet undeniably there. A trick of tired eyes, no doubt. The ocean plays cruel games. I scoffed. The sea indeed could play tricks, but Elias's subsequent entries became increasingly fixated on this trick. April 4th. The shape again. Fainter tonight, but present. It holds position for a moment, caught in the sweeping glare of the lamp, then vanishes as the beam passes. I find myself straining, anticipating its return with each rotation. A foolish fixation. Foolish? Perhaps. But the dread in Elias's meticulous hand was palpable. He began to describe the light, the magnificent mechanism I now tended, with a growing sense of disquiet. The giant clockwork, its brass gears gleaming under the soft lamp, seemed to him no longer a guarantor of safety, but an instrument of revelation. The beam, a benevolent guide, had become a malevolent spotlight, dragging something from the profound darkness of the deep. May 1st, the storm rages, a true beast of wind and water. The spray lashes the glass, and the tower groans like a dying whale. But even through the tempest, the shape persists. And tonight, it is closer. Not by much, an imperceptible fraction of a degree in the vast expanse of the ocean, but undeniably closer. The beam caught it, held it for a beat longer. A darker mass against the black, undulating water. My own nights at Godsend Light had been long and silent, punctuated only by the mournful wail of the foghorn and the tireless sweep of the beam. I had felt the loneliness, the oppressive weight of the world reduced to the confines of this stone cylinder. But I had not yet seen Elias's shape. I found myself anticipating the night with a new, unwelcome anxiety. I checked the horizon with my spyglass during the day, saw nothing but the ceaseless gray-green swell. Yet as dusk bled into night and the lamp was lit, I felt a prickle on the back of my neck. Elias's logbook continued its grim unfolding. He detailed the mechanics of his growing terror. The light, the beam, was not merely revealing the shape. It was, in some unspeakable way, summoning it. Or perhaps the shape was drawn to the light, a moth to a flame, but a moth of truly monstrous proportions. June 10th. I charted its position tonight. My hand shook, but I forced it steady. It is closer. The movement is so slight, so insidious, that it would be missed by any other. But I am here, alone, with nothing but the endless sea and the relentless rotation of the lamp. I measure its progress, rotation by rotation. It is less a movement and more a drawing forth. With every sweep of the beam, it is drawn inward, infinitesimally, towards this rock, towards me. The methodical madness. Elias, the meticulous keeper, turned his very duties into a means of charting his own impending doom. The thought sent a shiver down my spine. I was now operating the very lamp that had driven him to such a precise insanity. Was I now privy to the same slow, horrifying reveal? For a week, I tended the lamp, my eyes darting to the horizon with each pass of the beam, searching, dreading. The storm had broken, leaving the sea deceptively calm, a vast black mirror under the stars. And then, it happened. It was a moonless night, the kind of darkness that swallowed all but the brightest stars and the unwavering sweep of the lamp. The beam swung around, cutting its brilliant arc through the velvet black. For a fraction of a second, just on the very edge of where the light faded into impenetrable gloom, I saw it. A distortion, a ripple, in the fabric of the dark water. Not quite a wave, not quite a shadow. It was there, then gone, swallowed again by the night as the beam moved on. My breath caught in my throat. I squeezed my eyes shut, then opened them. Nothing, just the vast, indifferent ocean. Had I imagined it? Had Elias's words, absorbed into my mind, created a phantom? I wanted to believe it, desperately. But a cold knot formed in my stomach, a premonition. The next night, I saw it again. And the night after. Each time, it was slightly clearer, slightly more defined. For that fleeting moment, the beam held it. It wasn't a ship. It wasn't debris. It had no discernible mast or hull. It was a presence, a vast, formless shadow that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it, a void within the void. Elias's entries became more frantic. July 19th. It gains ground, relentlessly. I see it now, almost every rotation. It is immense, far larger than any vessel known to man. It does not move as a ship moves, propelled by current or wind. It merely exists, and with each sweep of the light, it is drawn a fraction closer. It is like a spider, slowly, endlessly reeling in its web. And the web, I fear, is the light itself. He wrote of the silence, the profound quiet of the lighthouse, which had once been a comfort, but now felt like a shroud. The only sounds were the wind, the waves, and the eternal clack of the lantern mechanism, each sound a beat closer to some unimaginable confrontation. Elias began to speak of the pressure, a crushing weight in his chest, as if the immense presence was not only drawing closer physically, but spiritually. He felt it in his dreams, saw it in the patterns on the walls, heard it in the roar of the surf. I, too, began to feel it. The lighthouse, once a beacon of safety, now felt like a cage, its windows the bars, its light a trap. Each evening, as I ascended to the spiral stairs to the lamp room, a sense of dread coiled tighter in my gut. The first few rotations of the lamp were always the worst, my heart hammering against my ribs, waiting for that terrifying glimpse. By August, Elias's writing devolved into a chilling stream of consciousness, a desperate attempt to record the horror before it consumed him entirely. August 1st. It has a shape now, vague but discernible. Not a living thing, not a construct. It is a geometry of shadow, like a vast, broken shard of night, endlessly turning, always presenting its darkest face. It is impossibly large, and it is coming for the light, for my light. August 10th. The air is colder when it passes through the beam, a distinct chill, though the wind does not change. I can feel its presence. It exerts a pressure on the tower, a kind of inverse gravity, drawing us both towards it. I cannot look away. My eyes are fixed on the point where the beam will next reveal it. It is an addiction, a terrible, fatal fascination. I understood him. I found myself doing the same. My sleep was fractured, haunted by visions of colossal, turning darkness. During the day, I would stare out at the indifferent ocean, trying to reconcile the vast emptiness with the chilling reality that something was out there, inching its way towards me, night after night. The storm came, a relentless tempest that raged for 3 days, isolating godsend light from the world more completely than ever before. The waves crashed against the rock with the force of cannon fire, sending spray 50 feet into the air. The wind shrieked like a banshee, threatening to tear the very cap from the tower. I worked ceaselessly, trimming the wick, polishing the lens, ensuring the lamp's unwavering brilliance. It was my duty, my only defense against the encroaching chaos, both natural and unnatural. But the storm, for all its fury, did not deter the shape. In fact, it seemed to revel in it. The wild, churning waters provided a perfect cloak, making it harder to discern. Yet I knew it was still there, still closer. The flashes of lightning, though brief, sometimes revealed a glimpse of it beyond the beam, a momentary silhouette against the boiling sky. It was larger now, so much larger. Elias's final entries were scrawled, desperate, almost illegible. September 22nd. It is upon us. I can feel its cold breath. It is no longer just on the horizon. It is just beyond the reach of the beam, waiting in the absolute blackness. The light still pulls it, still brings it in. But now, it is almost here. It will touch the tower. It will touch me. September 23rd. The rotations are faster now, or perhaps it is only my mind. It consumes the light. It drains the warmth from the lamp. The beam is weaker when it passes through its immense, shadowy form. I see eyes. No, not eyes. Places where the darkness is deeper still. A terrible maw. A silent void. September 24th. The scraping. I hear it. A sound like rock grinding against rock, but deeper, wetter. It is trying to climb. It wants in. It wants the light. I must extinguish it. I must make it stop. The light brought it here. The light will doom us all. This was the entry that chilled me most profoundly. To extinguish the light, the very purpose of the lighthouse, the reason for Elias's existence. It was the ultimate act of despair, born of a terror that transcended all duty. I reached September 25th in Elias's logbook, the final entry. Only a few lines, jagged and violent. It is here. It is at the glass. It is pressing against the lantern room. It sees me. The eyes, those voids, they see. It wants what is inside. The light, the warmth, my soul. I must stop it. I must silence the light. I must leap into the dark before it consumes me, before it takes the light. And then, nothing. The next page was blank. That was the day Elias Thorne was found at the base of the rock. The wind howled outside, a constant, mournful dirge. The beam of God-send light cut its steady path through the night, illuminating nothing but empty ocean and swirling mist. My hand trembled as I closed the logbook. I had to know. I had to see. I climbed the final rungs to the lantern room, the air colder than usual. A subtle, creeping chill that had nothing to do with the outside temperature. I stood by the glass, my breath misting on the cold pane. The lamp whirred, its gears a relentless heartbeat in the silence. The beam swept around. It was there, just as Elias had described, a vast, undulating shadow, barely visible in the farthest reach of the light, but larger now than anything a man could conceive. It seemed to stretch for miles, a truly colossal presence. My heart leaped into my throat, a frantic bird desperate for escape. The beam passed. Darkness. Then, the slow, agonizing swing back. I braced myself. The light returned, and for that brief, terrifying moment, it was clearer, closer. A truly immense form, featureless, yet pregnant with an ancient, unspeakable malevolence. It was the negative of a thing, an absence that somehow displaced the ocean around it. It did not move as a creature would. It was simply there, and with each rotation of the light, it was drawn inward. I stood transfixed, a moth caught in my own lamp as the night wore on. Hours passed. The clockwork mechanism, once a soothing rhythm, now beat like a drum of doom. Each clack, whir, clack was a step closer for the silent titan in the deep. The air in the lantern room grew colder, the chill radiating not from the glass, but from something beyond it. I could feel its immense presence, pressing against the very structure of the lighthouse. It was like a living wall of dread, pushing in from all sides. The beam swung. It was so close now, too close. I could almost make out details, but my mind recoiled from what it perceived. Indentations, like vast, blind craters. Edges that seemed to fold in on themselves, defying logic. It was not of this world. It was something from the abyssal darkness between stars. And then I heard it. A faint, low grating sound, like immense stone being dragged across a seabed. A scraping, just as Elias had described. It was coming from below, from the very base of the rock. It was climbing. My blood ran cold. The lighthouse, my sanctuary, was becoming my tomb. The light, my purpose, was my undoing. It was drawing the thing to me. The beam swung back, illuminating the terrible presence, and this time, it was unmistakably, horrifically close. So close that a chill, unlike any I had ever known, seeped through the thick glass, into my very bones. And in that blinding flash, I saw it. Not eyes, no, but vast, dark hollows, like the absence of light itself, fixed on the lantern room. On me. The light passed. Darkness. My breath hitched. I knew, with absolute certainty, that when the beam returned, it would reveal it, almost touching the glass. My predecessor's final, desperate act flashed through my mind. To silence the light. To leap into the dark. But I was frozen, mesmerized by the silent horror that awaited its next illumination. The gears whirred, the clockwork inexorable. The light began its slow, inevitable return. I stared, wide-eyed, into the approaching brilliance, knowing that it would reveal, with terrifying clarity, the thing that had haunted Elias Thorne. Now, finally, had come for me. The scraping sound grew louder, closer, and the air in the lantern room, once merely cold, became truly, utterly frigid, the kind of cold that steals the warmth from your very soul. The beam swung around, and I waited for the final reveal, knowing, with chilling certainty, that the Lanternist's lament was about to become my own. Fourth story, the low hum. In the vast, intricate symphony of the world, most ears perceive only a fraction of the composition. They glide over the deep bass notes, the resonant rumbles that underpin existence, dismissing them as the mundane tremors of a bustling planet. But Arthur, a man whose life was meticulously tuned to the nuances of sound, heard everything. A virtuoso of the cello, his hearing was less an asset and more a vulnerability, a finely calibrated instrument perpetually open to the cacophony of life. He heard the faint groan of a building settling, the distant hum of power lines, the microscopic friction of air molecules against a pane of glass. It was both his gift and his curse, a relentless clarity that made silence an almost impossible dream. When he first stepped into the newly constructed, impossibly sleek apartment on the 23rd floor, a scent of quietude, a rare and precious commodity, had momentarily enveloped him. The polished concrete, the minimalist lines, the panoramic windows gazing out onto a city that seemed almost muted from this height. It promised sanctuary. He had spent weeks prior in a temporary dwelling, a place plagued by the incessant thrum of an antiquated boiler and the high-pitched whine of faulty wiring. And the prospect of true sonic tranquility was intoxicating. The building was advertised as state-of-the-art, sound-dampened, a haven of modern living. For a musician who often practiced late into the night, and whose very profession demanded acute auditory focus, it seemed a perfect fit. He unpacked his cello, its rich, varnished wood gleaming under the soft, recessed lighting. And for the first few hours, all was serene. The faint traffic murmur from below was a distant, almost pleasant, white noise. Then it began. So subtly at first, he almost dismissed it as a phantom echo of his previous ordeal. A low, persistent hum. It wasn't loud, not by any conventional measure. It was more like a feeling, a deep-seated vibration that resonated not in his ears, but in the very bones of his skull. A silent chord struck somewhere beneath the threshold of ordinary perception. He paused, bow suspended over strings, and tilted his head, listening. Nothing. Only the expectant stillness of the apartment. He shrugged it off, attributing it to fatigue, or perhaps the lingering sensitivity from the old boiler. But it persisted, day and night, a constant, unwavering throb that seemed to originate from nowhere and everywhere at once. It was always there, a deep, almost infrasonic drone, too low to register as a distinct note, too pervasive to ignore. He tried to pinpoint its source. He moved from room to room, pressing his ear to walls, floors, even the ceiling. The kitchen, the bedroom, the living area. The hum remained constant, an unyielding presence. He checked the refrigerator, the air conditioning unit, the building's main power panel. All clear. No discernible mechanical culprit. He even went so far as to switch off the main breaker to his apartment, plunging the space into absolute darkness and silence. Yet even in that profound void, the hum remained. Faint, yes, but undeniably there, a testament to its independence from his own electrical grid. His friends, fellow musicians, laughed gently when he mentioned it. "You're just hearing the city, Arthur," they'd say. "Or maybe your brain is still ringing from that last symphony." He'd invite them over, desperate for a second opinion, for validation of his eroding sanity. He'd sit them down in the quietest part of his living room, urging them to concentrate, to truly listen. They'd cock their heads, furrow their brows, and invariably shake them. "I don't hear a thing, old man," his closest friend Thomas had declared, genuinely perplexed. "Just the usual background noise." The isolation of his perception was more unsettling than the hum itself. It made him question not just his hearing, but his very grasp on reality. Was he truly so unique in his auditory sensitivity that he was privy to a frequency no one else could access? Or was something far more sinister at play, something only he was destined to perceive? He began to wear noise-canceling headphones constantly, even when not listening to music, hoping to drown out the low thrum. It offered a temporary reprieve, but the moment they were removed, the hum would rush back in, stronger, more demanding, as if asserting its dominion. Sleep became a luxury. The hum was an unwelcome lullaby, a subterranean throb that resonated deep within his consciousness. He tried sleeping with earplugs, but they only served to amplify the internal resonance, turning the faint hum into a deafening roar inside his head. He grew haggard, his eyes perpetually shadowed, his once precise musical hand now prone to tremors. His focus in practice waned. The subtle shifts in pitch, the delicate phrasing, all seemed overshadowed by the relentless, unyielding thrum. It was during one such sleepless night, bathed in the pale glow of the streetlights filtering through his window, that he noticed the first anomaly. A small, rather insignificant thing. His reading glasses, which he habitually left on the bedside table, precisely aligned with the edge, were now a millimeter or two inward. He blinked, rubbed his eyes, and leaned closer. No, not imagined. They had shifted. He attributed it to restless sleep, perhaps an unconscious brush of his arm. But a seed of unease had been planted. The next morning, it was his favorite fountain pen, a heavy brass instrument he always left diagonally across his desk blotter. It had rotated, ever so slightly, its tip now pointing directly north. And then, a book, a thick volume of poetry, which he had left perfectly centered on his coffee table. It had drifted a fraction of an inch to the left. These were minuscule movements, almost imperceptible. A rational mind would dismiss them as coincidence, as the minor disturbances of everyday life. But Arthur's mind was no longer entirely rational, not since the hum had taken root. He started documenting them. He took photographs with his phone, laying a ruler alongside the objects. He used painter's tape to mark their exact positions before bed. Each morning, without fail, a subtle deviation. A key on the hallway table, once perpendicular to the wall, was now angled. A glass of water, left on his nightstand, had crept closer to the edge, as if drawn by an invisible current. The movements were never violent, never sudden. They were slow, deliberate, almost geological in their pace, measured in fractions of an inch, in degrees of rotation. But they were constant, and they were undeniably real. A new, chilling hypothesis began to form in his mind. The hum wasn't just a sound. It was a presence, a silent, unseen entity that used the low frequency as its voice, its means of interaction, and it was moving his things. Not randomly, he began to realize, but with a purpose. He would observe a book move from one spot to another over several nights, and then a coaster would follow, then a small figurine. Slowly, incrementally, like pieces on an invisible chessboard, they were being rearranged. He spent hours, days, meticulously mapping the movements. He transferred his photographs to his computer, overlaying them, drawing lines, trying to find a pattern in the seemingly random displacement. At first, it seemed chaotic. A key here, a book there, a pen over there. But as more and more data points accumulated, a terrifying realization began to dawn on him. The objects weren't just moving. They were forming shapes, geometric configurations, triangles, squares, then more complex, almost runic symbols. These weren't haphazard shifts. They were precisely orchestrated, slow-motion acts of construction. His apartment, once a sanctuary, transformed into an open-air laboratory, a stage for this unseen architect. He removed all unnecessary clutter, leaving only essential furniture and the objects that were being manipulated. He began to leave out specific items, almost as an offering, or a challenge, to see if they would be incorporated into the evolving design. A silver locket, an antique compass, a single, polished stone. Slowly, they too became part of the creeping choreography. The hum intensified with each new revelation. It was no longer just a drone. It had subtle modulations, almost like whispers, rising and falling with an unseen tide. Sometimes, he swore he could detect an almost rhythmic quality to it, like a heartbeat, or the slow, deliberate breath of something immense. When a particularly complex shape began to emerge from the rearranged objects, a series of interlocking circles forming a precise pattern on his living room floor, the hum resonated with a new, almost triumphant depth. Fear, cold and sharp, became his constant companion. He stopped leaving the apartment, paralyzed by the thought of what might happen in his absence. What pattern might emerge while he was gone? What terrible message was being etched into his living space, one meticulous millimeter at a time? He tried to decipher the meaning. Was it a language? A map? An invocation? The symbols were alien, yet hauntingly familiar, like echoes from a forgotten dream. One night, the hum was particularly vibrant, almost thrumming with excitement. He had laid out a series of old photographs on his dining table, images of his family, hoping to see if the presence would interact with something so personal. He fell asleep, exhausted, in his armchair, the hum vibrating through the floorboards, through the very fabric of his being. He woke with a gasp. The photographs were not just moved. They were arranged in a perfect, unsettling spiral on the table, centering on a single, faded image of his grandmother. And emanating from the very center of that spiral, directly from the photograph, was the hum. It was no longer an external presence. It was coming from within the arranged objects themselves, radiating outwards, a low, resonant wave that pulsed through his entire apartment. He stared at the spiral, then at the photograph, then back at the objects that had formed the intricate designs on his floor and shelves. The pieces were coalescing, forming a larger, terrifying tapestry across his entire living space. He felt the hum, not just in his bones now, but in his mind, a direct, invasive presence that bypasses his ears and resonated in his very thoughts. It was communicating, not with words, but with vibration, with subtle movements, with the insidious rearrangement of his world. What it wanted, what it was, he still couldn't say. But as the hum intensified, filling every corner of his apartment, every cavity of his skull, he knew one thing with chilling certainty. The pattern was nearing completion, and whatever it revealed, whatever it invoked, it was meant for him, and him alone. The sanctuary had become a cage, the silence a symphony of dread, and Arthur, the musician with the cursed hearing, was merely an instrument in an orchestra he could not escape. The low hum, his constant companion, was no longer just a sound. It was the rhythm of his unraveling, and it played on endlessly in the quiet, empty spaces of his mind. Fifth story, the Echowood. Anya Sharma found her solace in solitude, and for years her wanderings had led her to the most remote outposts the Park Service could offer. So, when the assignment to the Echowood came, she accepted it, not only with alacrity, but with a quiet sense of triumph. A vast, ancient forest, rumored to possess peculiar acoustic properties, stretching for hundreds of miles, largely untouched by the hurried footsteps of modern civilization. It sounded less like a job, and more like a whispered invitation. Her cabin was a sturdy, aged structure, nestled deep within the verdant embrace of colossal pines and stoic oaks. Its windows, perpetually shaded by the dense canopy, offered glimpses into a world of dappled light and profound quiet. The quiet, however, was deceptive. Almost immediately, Anya noticed the forest's unique characteristic. A dropped twig seemed to fall twice. A bird's call reverberated with an unnerving linger, and her own footsteps, light as they were, seemed to return to her, a faint, phantom tread following her own. It was charming at first, a novelty, when she whistled a low, mournful tune one afternoon. The forest responded, a softer, distant echo of the melody winding back to her through the trees. It was like living within a natural amphitheater, a playful resonance that added a layer of mystical beauty to her already idyllic surroundings. She found herself speaking aloud more often, just to hear her words return, slightly altered, as if the forest itself were listening, and then repeating them back in its own arcane tongue. Days bled into weeks, each one marked by the rhythmic simplicity of her ranger duties. She checked traps, monitored wildlife, patrolled trails that few humans ever trod, and meticulously logged her observations. the echoes grew more distinct, less like a faint whisper, and more like a clear, if still gentle, reverberation. She found herself growing fond of them, a constant, unobtrusive companion in her profound isolation. One crisp morning, as she made her way along the winding path to the old fire lookout, Anya was humming a tune she'd heard on her portable radio the previous evening. Suddenly, a distinct fragment of a conversation she'd had with herself that very morning floated back to her from the depths of the forest, clear as a bell. "Coffee's a bit strong today." She paused, her humming dying on her lips. She had indeed muttered that exact phrase while pouring her second cup, barely an hour ago. A faint chill, not of the morning air, traced its way up her spine. It was a peculiar echo, certainly. She shook her head, dismissing it as a trick of the wind, or perhaps an odd acoustic anomaly she hadn't yet fully grasped. The Echowood was, after all, named for its echoes. It was only natural they would become more pronounced. But the incidents began to accumulate. That afternoon, as she checked a bear trap, she heard a faint, familiar sigh, and then her own voice. "Just an empty cage." She'd said that aloud, just after her morning coffee incident. The timing was off. It wasn't an immediate echo. It was a delayed one. Not by much, perhaps an hour or two, but enough to prickle at the edges of her comfort. The charming novelty began to fray, replaced by a subtle unease. The forest, once a playful companion, now felt like an attentive listener, holding on to her words, playing them back when she least expected it. She started being more careful with what she said aloud, even to herself. A strange, solitary self-consciousness settled over her. Then came the conversation from days ago. It was during a particularly grueling patrol, when a sudden storm had trapped her far from the cabin. She had found shelter under a thick overhang of rock, and in the quiet desperation of the downpour, she had spoken to herself, a litany of small complaints and frustrations aimed at no one but the unfeeling sky. "This rain," she'd grumbled, "it'll never let up. My boots are soaked through, and I swear that branch just slapped me in the face." 2 days later, as she was boiling water for tea in her cabin, a faint, wet, shushing sound seemed to emanate from the wall behind her. Then, her own voice, clear as if she stood just outside the window, echoed from the forest edge. "This rain, it'll never let up. My boots are soaked through, and I swear that branch just slapped me in the face." The words were precisely as she had spoken them, the tone identical. Anya dropped the kettle, hot water splashing onto the wooden floor. This was no trick of the wind. This was the forest. And it was repeating things, not just from hours, but from days ago. It was archiving her existence, playing back fragments of her past. A cold, creeping fear began to take root in her chest, intertwining with the deep quiet of the woods. She started experimenting, cautiously at first. She'd speak a random phrase, then listen. Sometimes it would return quickly, a simple echo. But sometimes, days later, that same phrase would drift back to her, disembodied, from a direction she hadn't expected. The Echowood wasn't just echoing her. It was remembering her. It was remembering every casual utterance, every muttered complaint, every lonely word spoken into the vastness. The solitude, once her comfort, now became her torment. Every sound she made, every word she uttered, felt like an entry in a colossal, unseen ledger. She imagined the forest floor beneath her, not as earth and roots, but but as an intricate network of sentient recording devices, each leaf a microphone, each tree a speaker, waiting for the opportune moment to play back her life's soundtrack. She began to spend her days in near silence, communicating only when absolutely necessary, and then in hushed tones. But even her silence felt loud in the echoing wood. The forest, it seemed, had grown accustomed to her voice, and its memory wasn't limited to what she spoke. The true fear, the kind that burrowed deep into the marrow of her bones, began subtly. She was sitting by the river one evening, watching the last slivers of sunlight play on the water, when a thought, unbidden and deeply private, drifted through her mind. I miss my sister. Why did we ever drift apart? It was a silent lament, a wistful internal sigh that no one, not even the most astute observer, could have perceived. A moment later, from across the river, a whisper, faint but unmistakably hers, slithered through the air. Why did we ever drift apart? Anya froze. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drum in the sudden, absolute silence of the forest. She hadn't spoken that thought. Not a single sound had escaped her lips. It was a purely internal lament, a fleeting thought, a silent pain she harbored deep within. Yet the Echowood had heard it. The echoes of her unspoken thoughts became more frequent, more invasive. They were never loud, always a soft, insidious whisper. Yet each one struck her like a physical blow. The forest wasn't just recording what she said. It was recording what she thought. It was plumbing the depths of her mind, extracting her insecurities, her anxieties, her deepest, most guarded fears, and then, with cruel indifference, playing them back to her. Am I good enough for this job? She'd think, grappling with a difficult decision regarding a damaged trail. Minutes later, from the rustling leaves above, her own internal question would float down, a mocking indictment. Good enough for this job? The whispers multiplied, becoming a dreadful chorus. They were not just echoes, but manifestations of her inner turmoil. The forest knew her better than she knew herself, or at least it knew the parts of her she desperately tried to suppress. Her fears of failure, her regrets, her moments of weakness, her secret desires, all were laid bare, reverberating through the ancient trees. Sleep became impossible. The cabin, once a sanctuary, felt like a glass house, its walls permeable to the forest's psychic intrusion. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle outside, seemed to carry the potential for another chilling echo of her deepest fears. She would lie awake, staring into the oppressive darkness, straining to hear, yet dreading what she might hear. She tried to fight back. She attempted to fill her mind with mundane, repetitive thoughts, hoping to dull the forest's senses. She hummed nonsensical tunes silently to herself, recited numbers, anything to create a mental static that the Echowood could not penetrate. But the forest was persistent. It would patiently wait, then pluck a forgotten worry from the recesses of her memory, a fear she hadn't consciously acknowledged in years, and present it to her in her own whispered voice. One night, the wind howled through the canopy, a frantic, keening sound that seemed to mirror Anya's own mounting hysteria. She sat huddled by the dying embers of her fire, clutching a thick woolen blanket around her, her eyes wide and bloodshot. The whispers started then, not just individual thoughts, but a cacophony of them, overlapping, vying for dominance. She heard the echo of her childhood fear of the dark. Something's under the bed? Then a later anxiety about her career. What if I fail? A forgotten regret. I should have said goodbye. And then, the one that broke her. You are truly alone. It was a chorus of her own vulnerabilities, her own secret nightmares, amplified and thrown back at her by the very wilderness she had sought for peace. The forest was not merely echoing. It was mocking. It was a living, breathing psychoanalyst, dissecting her soul and presenting its findings in the most terrifying way imaginable. Anya stumbled out of the cabin, the whispers chasing her, swirling around her like a malevolent fog. She ran, blindly, through the familiar paths, but they felt alien now. Each tree a monument to a whispered secret, each shadow a lurking fear. The echoes intensified, not fading with distance, but growing louder, more urgent, until they were deafening, a storm of her own internal chaos. She fell, tearing her hands on the rough bark of a fallen log, her breath ragged, tears streaming down her face. The whispers pressed in, 1,000 voices, all hers, all revealing. She looked up at the towering trees, their ancient branches reaching into the inky sky like skeletal fingers. There was no malevolence in their gaze, only an indifferent, profound knowledge. The Echowood wasn't trying to hurt her. It was simply being. It was a mirror, reflecting every sound, every word, every thought, back to its source. And in its perfect, unyielding reflection, Anya saw the true horror. Not the forest itself, but the raw, unedited landscape of her own mind. She didn't know if she would ever leave the Echowood. The trail out, miles upon miles away, seemed insurmountable. Not because of the physical distance, but because of the mental journey it would entail, with every step accompanied by the haunting echoes of her past and her most private terrors. Perhaps, she thought, this was her new existence, to be a permanent part of the forest's vast, living archive, her every thought eternally preserved and replayed by the silent, judging trees. The last thing she heard, as the first rays of dawn pierced the canopy, was a faint, almost tender whisper, indistinguishable from the rustle of leaves, but distinctly her own voice, speaking a thought she had suppressed for years. I just want to disappear. And the Echowood, as always, echoed it back. 6th story. The Archivist of Lost Things. In the hushed heart of the city, nestled between buildings that had long forgotten their own origins, stood a structure unlike any other. It was known, to the vanishing few who knew it at all, as the Archive of Lost Things. Not a library of books, for words were too solid, too easily captured by the human mind. This archive housed something far more fragile, far more precious. The echoes, the lingering whispers, the final, tangible memories of everything the world had irrevocably let slip away. Elias Thorne, a man whose skin was as parchment and whose eyes held the weary wisdom of centuries, was its sole custodian. He was more than a keeper. He was the last vessel, the final, shimmering thread connecting these forgotten fragments to existence. Within these walls, a jar might hold the last breath of a flower whose petals had long since dissolved into dust. Its scent, a phantom kiss from an extinct garden. A tarnished silver locket, no larger than a child's thumbnail, might hum with the last notes of a lullaby, sung to a civilization that crumbled before the first written word. Each item, unique and irreplaceable, was a final stand against true oblivion, its very being dependent on Elias's failing, fragile memory. The archive itself was a labyrinth of shadowed shelves, narrow aisles, and nooks that seemed to breathe with the quiet sigh of countless forgotten things. Dust motes danced in the solitary beams of moonlight that pierced the high, grimy windows, looking like tiny, shimmering galaxies, holding their own secrets. The air was thick, not with the must of old paper, but with the subtle, melancholic fragrances of forgotten epochs, the tang of vanished oceans, the faint spice of extinct feasts, the metallic tang of battles fought on fields now paved over by progress. Elias moved through his domain with a slow, deliberate grace, his footsteps barely disturbing the pervasive stillness. His nightly ritual was a sacred act, a desperate vigil against the encroaching tide of nothingness. He would walk the aisles, his gnarled fingers tracing the contours of a smooth, featureless stone, feeling the faint warmth of a miniature, intricately carved wooden bird, or gently turning a music box that played a melody so exquisite, so profoundly sorrowful, that it felt like a memory of a pain not his own. Each touch, each quiet moment of contemplation was an affirmation, a whispered plea for existence. "You are here," he would murmur to the silence. "I remember you." But Elias was old, older than any man should be. The weight of millennia of lost memories pressed down upon him, a ceaseless, crushing burden. His own memories, once sharp as newly cut glass, were now like pebbles, tumbled smooth by an indifferent river, their edges softened, their details blurred. He felt the insidious creeping of forgetfulness, not as a loss of personal history, but as a direct threat to the very fabric of the archive. Each flicker, each momentary blankness in his mind was a microscopic tear in the tapestry of existence, a silent scream of a thing being unmade. Tonight, the silence felt heavier, charged with an almost palpable anxiety. The air, usually a balm, felt cool and thin, as if something vital was slowly being drawn from it. Elias's brow was furrowed, a deep valley carved by decades of relentless concentration. His gaze kept returning to a particular object resting on a velvet cushion on his small, cluttered desk. It was a smooth, utterly featureless gray stone. It fit perfectly into the palm of his hand, its surface cool and slick, like riverstone. He had held it countless times. He knew, with an instinct that chilled him to the bone, that it was profoundly important, perhaps one of the most vital items in the entire archive. Yet he could not, for the fading life of him, recall its purpose. A cold dread, a fear far more profound than any ordinary terror, coiled in his gut. This wasn't simply forgetting where he put his spectacles. This was the terror of absolute erasure. "What are you?" he whispered, his voice a dry rasp in the vast quiet. He turned the stone over and over in his palm, his thumb absently stroking its unyielding surface. There was no unique indentation, no marking, no warmth or hum, nothing to give him a clue. It was, quite simply, a gray stone. And yet, the sheer weight of its forgotten significance pressed down upon him, a silent, crushing indictment of his failing mind. He closed his eyes, willing the memory to surface. He pictured the moment he must have placed it in the archive, the context, the meaning that had once been so clear, so undeniable. But there was only a vast, echoing emptiness. The harder he pushed, the more elusive the memory became, like trying to grasp smoke. A faint tremor ran through the desk, rattling the antique inkwell. He opened his eyes sharply, glancing around. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to deepen, to coil and writhe, as if responding to his distress. He stood, his knees protesting, and began to pace. He walked to the shelf where he intuitively knew the stone belonged, though he couldn't name the section. Was it items of last words? No, this stone had no words attached, remnants of final journeys. Perhaps, but it felt wrong. The labels, meticulously crafted by his younger self, seemed to mock him now, their clear categories useless without the key. He stopped before a glass case containing a single, delicate feather, shimmering with iridescent hues that no living bird possessed. He remembered this one, the last feather shed by the great sky serpent, a creature of myth and cloud, whose existence was forgotten the moment its final scale dissolved into the ether. He touched the cool glass. The feathers stirred, ever so slightly, as if dreaming. The memory of the sky serpent was vibrant in his mind, held there by sheer force of will, a testament to his life's work. But the stone, the gray stone, it remained stubbornly blank. A faint, almost imperceptible hum began to vibrate through the floorboards. It was the sound of the archive itself, groaning under the strain. Each item in its silent chambers was connected to Elias, a vast, intricate web woven from his consciousness. When a memory wavered, the entire structure trembled. He returned to the stone, picking it up again. He held it to his ear, as if listening for a faint echo. Nothing. He pressed it against his forehead, desperately hoping for a transfer of knowledge, a spark of recognition. A dull ache began behind his eyes, a familiar precursor to deeper cognitive fog. Hours passed, marked only by the shifting angles of moonlight on the floor. Elias continued his desperate dance with oblivion. He tried association. What else was gray? The dust motes, the distant city smog. No, those were too common, too ephemeral. What else was smooth? A river stone, yes, but this felt older somehow, more fundamentally smooth, as if its very essence was smoothness, not merely a polished surface. He remembered a particularly vivid dream from decades ago, a fragment of a conversation with a woman whose face was now a blur, her words lost to time. She had spoken of the unmaking, of things that simply ceased to be, leaving no trace, not even a void. He had dismissed it then, secure in the knowledge that he, Elias Thorne, archivist of lost things, would prevent such a fate. Now the dream felt less like a nightmare and more like a prophecy. He wandered into the chamber of last sounds, a room where the air was perpetually filled with barely audible whispers and faint, sorrowful strains of music. He picked up a small, empty conch shell that held the last echo of a forgotten ocean's roar, its waves now silent forever. He held it to the stone, as if the memory of sound might awaken the stone's own slumbering purpose. The conch remained silent, its gentle hum undisturbed. The stone offered no response. Panic, cold and sharp, began to prick at him. He felt the encroaching silence, not just in the room, but within his own mind. A growing emptiness where the memory of the stone should reside. He thought of all the other things he had successfully safeguarded. The specific shade of twilight on a particular ancient tree. The unique taste of rain from a single storm that swept across a forgotten continent. The fleeting joy of a laugh that belonged to no one living. All these he held. All these he protected. But this stone, it felt like the very anchor of the archive, and it was slipping through his grasp. He collapsed back into his worn armchair, the stone still clutched tightly in his hand. His gaze drifted to a small, silver compass on a nearby shelf, its needle spinning wildly, forever pointing to a direction that no longer existed. He had saved that too. How? How had he managed to hold on to so much, only to lose something so seemingly simple, so devoid of discernible characteristic? He tried to reverse the process. Instead of trying to pull the memory from the stone, he tried to push possibilities onto it. Was it a focus for forgotten thoughts? A vessel for unspoken words? A key to a doorway that had long since vanished? Each idea floated away, baseless, ephemeral. The stone remained impassive, a perfect cipher. The hum in the archive intensified, now accompanied by a faint, high-pitched whine, like wind whistling through forgotten ruins. Shadows danced more frantically. Elias felt a profound sense of anguish emanating from the shelves, a collective plea from the forgotten. They were fading with him, their tenuous grasp on existence loosening with every beat of his faltering heart. He was their last defense, and he was failing. He closed his eyes again, tears threatening to sting his ancient lids. He pictured the gray stone not as an object, but as a void, a shape carved out of nothingness. What could fill that void? What could give it meaning? A sense of profound loss, a sorrow so deep it felt like a wound in his very soul, washed over him. He was losing it. He was losing them all. Then, a flicker. Not a memory, not a sight, but a feeling. A sensation of immense quietude, of infinite patience, of something standing still while the world rushed by. He squeezed the stone tighter, trying to hold on to that fleeting impression. He remembered a time, long, long ago, when the archive was not yet full, when there were still vast swaths of human experience that had not yet been entirely extinguished. He remembered the feeling of solitude, of being utterly alone in a world that was forgetting faster than he could remember. And then, he remembered finding the stone. Where? How? The details were still frustratingly out of reach. He recalled the silence that had permeated the air when he first touched it. A silence so profound, it felt like a presence. Not the mere absence of sound, but an active, consuming quiet. A silence that held the echoes of all things that would never be said. All songs that would never be sung. All movements that would never be made. He gasped, a dry, rattling sound. Could it be? The stone wasn't a container for a lost thing, but a manifestation of lost potential. The very last echo of what could have been, but never was. The uncreated, the unmanifested. He felt a profound exhaustion settle over him, an overwhelming weariness that threatened to drag him into unconsciousness. The hum in the archive quieted slightly, as if the forgotten things were holding their breath, waiting for his final decision. He looked at the stone again. Its gray surface, once blank, now seemed to shimmer with a faint, almost imperceptible aura of nothingness, the potential of everything and the reality of nothing. It was the inverse of all the other items, not a memory of what was, but a monument to what could have been. But that wasn't it. That felt like a truth, yes, but not the truth, not the specific purpose he knew it held. There was something more, something simpler, yet infinitely more terrifying. He thought of the weight of the stone in his hand. It was heavier than it looked, not physically heavy, but existentially so. He remembered the dread he had felt when he first encountered it. It was the same dread he felt now. Suddenly, a shard of an image pierced through the fog of his mind. A vast, empty landscape stretched out under an indifferent sky, and in the center, a single, solitary figure. Not him, not anyone he knew. Just a figure, observing. And the stone was there. Not held, not used, but simply present. He closed his eyes, concentrating all his failing might on that fleeting image. The figure was a silhouette against the horizon. The landscape was desolate, windswept. And the stone, it was a marker of absence. He shuddered. This was it. This was the memory. The gray stone was not an archive of a lost thing. It was the final, physical representation of the act of forgetting itself. It didn't hold a memory. It marked the precise moment, the exact point, where something had slipped into absolute oblivion, leaving no echo, no trace, no possibility of ever being remembered again. It was the gravestone of an unexistence. His eyes snapped open. The room was still, save for the frantic beating of his own heart. The hum in the archive had ceased. The shadows were calm. He had remembered. He had, for this night at least, pulled the stone back from the precipice of absolute void. He held it gently now, no longer with desperation, but with a profound, terrifying understanding. It was a terrifying object, a constant reminder of the failure he fought every waking moment. And his purpose, far from being a comfort, was chilling testament to the endless, relentless nature of forgetting. He carefully placed the stone back on its velvet cushion. As his fingers withdrew, he felt a faint, almost imperceptible warmth emanating from its surface, a transient whisper of acknowledgement. For now, it was safe. For now, it existed. Elias Thorne slumped back in his chair, utterly spent. The first rays of dawn were just beginning to filter through the high windows, painting the dust motes in hues of pale gold. Another night had passed, another battle fought, and, against all odds, won. But the victory was fleeting. He looked at his trembling hands, at the fine network of wrinkles that marred their surface. His memory was a sieve, leaking precious droplets of existence with every passing moment. He knew that one day, perhaps soon, he would pick up that gray stone again, and he would not remember. And when that day came, the stone would cease to be, and with it, the very concept it represented, the ultimate, irreversible act of pure oblivion, would vanish from the universe, leaving no trace that it had ever been conceived or feared. The archive would lose its most terrifying exhibit, and Elias Thorne, the last archivist, would lose the very last memory of the unmaking. The thought was not just terrifying. It was a promise of utter, profound silence. And he was very, very tired. He just hoped that when that day came, he wouldn't even remember to be afraid. 7th story. The delay in the glass. Ethan had a particular fondness for forgotten things. Not just antiques, mind you, but objects that felt as though they had lived many lives before arriving at his doorstep. Each scratch and fade a testament to a whispered history. His small apartment, a student's haven nestled above a bustling bakery, was an eclectic jumble of such finds. A chipped porcelain teapot from the 1920s, a globe with faded political boundaries, and stacks of well-loved, dog-eared books. It was this affection for the aged and overlooked that led him, one languid Saturday afternoon, to the sprawling chaos of the local flea market. The mirror caught his eye almost immediately. It stood propped against a stack of discarded vinyl records, nestled between a tarnished brass lamp and a headless mannequin. Its frame was a masterpiece of dark, carved wood, deeply burnished with age, featuring intricate, almost organic patterns that swirled like ancient vines. The glass itself was thick, beveled at the edges, and possessed a faint, almost imperceptible smokiness, as if it had absorbed countless centuries of breath and light. It wasn't just old, it felt significant. "How much for this one?" Ethan asked the vendor, a wizened man with eyes that seemed to have seen just as many forgotten things as the mirror itself. The price was surprisingly low, an indication perhaps of its unwieldiness or a lack of appreciation from the general market. Ethan, despite his student budget, couldn't resist. He negotiated a little, then paid, careful not to chip the delicate carvings as he awkwardly maneuvered the heavy piece into the back of a borrowed car. Back in his apartment, he wrestled it into the narrow hallway, a space that connected his living room to his bedroom and kitchen. It was the perfect spot, he decided, reflecting the warm glow from the living room lamp and adding a touch of old-world grandeur to an otherwise ordinary corridor. He stepped back, admiring his new acquisition. It was then that he noticed it. He raised a hand to adjust a stray lock of hair, and in the mirror, his reflection did the same. But there was a beat, a tiny, almost imperceptible fraction of a second before the mirrored hand moved. Ethan blinked. He waved slowly, his fingers unfurling in the air. The reflection's fingers mirrored his action, but it was as if a breath separated their movements, like a whisper echoing after the voice had ceased. He frowned, attributing it to fatigue, or perhaps the subtle distortions in antique glass. He tried again, waving faster this time. The lag was still there, like a hesitant echo. He leaned closer, peering into the smoky depths of the glass. His own eyes stared back, wide and curious, but even his blinking seemed to happen just a hair's breadth after he felt his own eyelids flutter. It was bizarre, certainly, but hardly alarming. He chuckled to himself. A trick mirror, perhaps, a curious anomaly, a unique quirk that only added to its charm. He imagined it was a result of some ancient, forgotten technique of glassmaking, or perhaps a subtle warp in the frame. He dismissed it, attributing it to the oddities of old things, and went about his evening, the peculiar delay already fading from his conscious thought. The next morning, the delay seemed a touch more pronounced. He stood before the mirror, brushing his teeth, and watched as his reflection's arm rose, the brush nearing its mouth, just a flicker behind his own movement. He stopped, and the reflection stopped. He began again, and it followed, ever so slightly out of sync. It was like watching a poorly dubbed film, the audio just slightly ahead or behind the lip movements. He tested it. He'd raise his left hand quickly, then drop it. The reflection would respond, but the ascent and descent seemed to stretch over a marginally longer period. He tried a quick nod, then a shake of his head. The mirrored Ethan would nod, then shake his head, but always that minuscule beat behind. He tried to trick it, moving erratically, but the reflection, with its maddening, consistent lag, remained his perfect, albeit delayed, shadow. He found himself spending more time in the hallway than usual, a strange fascination taking hold. He'd walk past, catch a glimpse, and invariably pause to observe the curious phenomenon. He started timing it, crudely, in his head. What had been a mere blink of an eye now felt closer to half a second. He told himself he was imagining it, that his perception was being warped by his own focus. He tried to ignore it, but the mirror was right there, a constant presence in his everyday path. Days turned into a week. The initial amusement had evaporated, replaced by a low hum of unease. The delay was undeniable now, a full, discernible second. He'd scratch his head, and his reflection would respond a second later. He'd open his mouth to speak, and his mirrored mouth would only just begin to part as he finished his silent thought. It was becoming uncanny. He started to feel a prickle of something akin to annoyance, as if the mirror were deliberately mocking him with its sluggish imitation. He tried moving the mirror, thinking perhaps the angle of light or the orientation in the hallway was somehow causing the distortion. He painstakingly shifted it to different walls, even tried it in the living room, but the delay persisted, immutable. It was inherent to the glass, he concluded, some property he couldn't comprehend. He even researched antique mirrors, looking for historical anecdotes of such phenomena, but found nothing. No mention of time-lagging glass or echoing reflections. The second week brought a more profound sense of dread. The delay wasn't just a second anymore. It was 2, sometimes 3. He'd walk into the hallway, glance at the mirror, and see his reflection still standing there, a ghost of his past movement, before slowly, eerily, beginning to turn and follow his present actions. It was like watching a slow-motion replay of himself, only the replay was happening after the live event. His friends started to notice his preoccupation. "Why are you always staring at that old thing?" his roommate Liam asked one evening, finding Ethan transfixed by the mirror. "It's peculiar," Ethan mumbled, not wanting to sound unhinged. "There's a delay in the reflection." Liam scoffed. "Must be the dust, or you need more sleep, mate." He waved a dismissive hand, and in the mirror, his reflection raised its hand just a beat too late. A subtle, chilling confirmation to Ethan alone. Ethan stopped inviting people over. He couldn't shake the feeling that the mirror was watching him, not just reflecting him. The delay wasn't just a temporal lag. It felt like a conscious observation, a patient waiting. He began to feel a strange, disquieting empathy for his reflection, trapped in a perpetual, slightly behind existence. He imagined it longing to catch up, to synchronize, to escape its temporal prison. Then came the 5-second mark. He woke one morning, feeling groggy, and walked into the hallway to get a glass of water. As he approached the mirror, he saw himself, his mirrored self, already standing there, facing him. For a full 5 seconds, his reflection simply stood, motionless, staring, before slowly, deliberately, raising its hand to touch its face. Then, 5 seconds later, Ethan found himself raising his own hand, echoing the reflection's prior movement. His blood ran cold. This wasn't a delay anymore. This was a precognition. His reflection was acting before him. He staggered back, heart pounding, a primal fear seizing him. He stumbled into the kitchen, splashing water on his face, trying to shake off the nightmarish vision. It couldn't be. It was impossible. His mind was playing tricks on him. Sleep deprivation, stress, anything but this. He tried to rationalize it. Maybe he had simply thought about raising his hand, and the reflection had reacted to that thought, a kind of bizarre, subconscious feedback loop. But the clarity of the vision, the distinct, unhurried movement of his mirrored hand, felt too real, too intentional, to be a mere trick of the mind. The next few days were a blur of growing terror. He avoided the hallway, taking circuitous routes through his apartment, stepping over furniture, anything to avoid a direct glance at the ornate frame that now seemed to hum with an unseen energy. But the hallway was unavoidable. He had to pass it to reach his bedroom, to leave the apartment. Each time, the scenario repeated, growing bolder, more explicit. He would approach the mirror, steeling himself, and see his reflection already doing something he hadn't yet conceived of. He'd see it turn its head slightly to the left, and then, a few seconds later, he would feel an irresistible urge to turn his own head, as if responding to an unheard command. He'd see his mirrored lips curve into a faint, chilling smile, a smile he himself was not feeling, a smile that seemed to anticipate some future, horrifying amusement. One afternoon, he stood before it, trembling. The delay was now close to 10 seconds. He looked into his own eyes, wide with fear, and watched as his reflection, slowly, languidly, extended a hand, palm open, towards the glass. Ethan felt a cold prickle on his own palm, a phantom touch. And then, a long 10 seconds later, he felt compelled to replicate the action, his own hand rising, floating towards the polished surface. He pulled back with a gasp, sweat beading on his forehead. It was pulling him in. It was dictating his actions. His reflection wasn't just showing him the future. It was creating it. He couldn't sleep. The mirror had become a malevolent presence, a silent, all-seeing eye in his hallway. He barricaded the door to the hallway with a heavy chest of drawers. But he knew it was futile. The mirror was still there, its power residing not in its physical location, but in its very nature. He felt its silent gaze through the walls, a patient, knowing watch. He considered smashing it. But what if that only made it worse? What if breaking the glass shattered whatever fragile barrier existed between him and the entity that now resided within? What if his reflection, once a captive echo, was finally set free? The thought paralyzed him. One night, he couldn't bear it any longer. He hadn't eaten properly in days, his mind a chaotic mess of fear and paranoia. He crept out of his bedroom, flashlight in hand, aiming its beam away from the hallway. He could feel its presence, a cold spot in the air, a hum beneath his skin. He peeked around the corner, flashlight still averted. The hallway was dark, illuminated only by the faint glow of the city lights filtering through the living room window. He took a deep breath, clenched his jaw, and slowly, deliberately, turned the flashlight towards the mirror. His reflection was already there. It wasn't just standing. It was leaning in close to the glass, its face contorted in a wide, triumphant grin. Its eyes, his own eyes, held a chilling, hungry glint. And then he saw it. As the beam of light settled on the reflection, its lips moved, slowly, forming a single silent word. He recognized the word, even though no sound escaped the glass. It was his name. And as he stood there, paralyzed by horror, the reflection's hand rose, not to touch the glass, but to beckon him closer. And Ethan felt, with an icy certainty, the irresistible pull to obey. His own feet began to shuffle forward, one step, then another, drawn by the terrifying promise of the delay in the glass. The gap was closing, not in time, but in reality. And he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that soon there would be no delay at all, only synchronization, a terrible, permanent alignment. And then, what would remain of him? 8th story, the last stop. The air in the carriage was thick with the scent of stale coffee, damp wool, and the faint metallic tang of a long day's industry. Elias leaned his head against the cold, grimy window, watching the blur of the city lights give way to the deeper, indistinct shadows of the outer districts. Another day bled into another night, each one a weary carbon copy of the last. His eyelids felt like lead weights, heavy and insistent. The rhythmic clack-clack of the train on the tracks, a lullaby of urban transit, coaxed him further into the embrace of exhaustion. He had missed his usual express, had lingered too long at the office, caught in a futile battle with a spreadsheet that refused to balance. Now, he was on the very last slow train, the one that crawled its way through every forgotten stop, disgorging its few remaining passengers into the silent, waiting streets. A sigh escaped him, more a release of tension than a sound. The overhead fluorescent lights hummed with a low, persistent whine, casting a jaundiced glow on the empty seats around him. Most had disembarked long ago. He was one of the last stragglers, clinging to the final threads of public transport before the city truly slept. He shifted, trying to find a more comfortable position, but comfort was an illusion. His tie felt like a noose. His shirt still bore the creases of a day spent hunched over a desk, and his briefcase, resting on the seat beside him, felt heavier than a coffin. Sleep. That was all he wanted. Deep, dreamless void to swallow the stress, the endless deadlines, the ache in his shoulders, and the dull throb behind his eyes. He closed them, surrendering to the gentle sway, the continuous, almost hypnotic drone of the train. The world outside his immediate consciousness began to dissolve, fragmenting into a comforting blur. Distant voices from another carriage, the soft rustle of a newspaper, the sigh of the air conditioning, all became muted, distorted, then faded into nothingness. The last thing he registered was the feeling of warmth seeping into his cheek from the window, and the comforting, predictable shudder of the train as it rounded a curve. Then, oblivion. He awoke with a jolt, a sudden, jarring lurch that sent a jolt of adrenaline through his system. His head snapped up from the window, his neck stiff, his eyes blinking rapidly in the oppressive gloom. For a moment, confusion reigned. Where was he? What time was it? Had he missed his stop? He scanned the carriage, his vision still blurry, his mind thick with the residue of a deep, unwilling sleep. The first thing he registered was the silence, not the quiet of a late-night train with a few sleeping passengers, but an absolute, profound absence of sound. The familiar hum of the air conditioning, the rhythmic clatter of the wheels, the distant murmur of the engine, all gone. There was only a low, almost imperceptible vibration beneath him, a ghostly tremor that suggested movement without sound. It was as if the train itself had swallowed its own voice. His eyes adjusted. The carriage was completely empty. Not a soul, not a single person, not a discarded newspaper, not even a forgotten coffee cup. The seats, usually bearing the faint impressions of their former occupants, were pristine, as if no one had ever sat in them. The overhead lights were still on, but their jaundiced glow seemed weaker now, struggling against an unnatural darkness that pressed in from beyond the windows. He pushed himself upright, his muscles screaming in protest. A quick glance at his watch confirmed his worst fears. 3 hours had passed. 3 hours since he'd drifted off. He should have been home, in his own bed, hours ago. Where was he? He looked out the window again, his breath catching in his throat. Instead of the familiar city lights, or even the dark, open stretches of countryside he would expect at this hour, there was only a seamless, unbroken wall of concrete. The train was moving through a tunnel, but this was no ordinary tunnel. The walls were smooth, featureless, devoid of any pipes, cables, or maintenance alcoves. There were no lights flashing past, no signs of life, no variations in the gray expanse. There was an endless, monotonous tube, rushing past the window in a dizzying, hypnotic blur. Panic began to coil in his gut, a cold, insidious tendril. He scrambled to his feet, fumbling for his phone. Dead. Of course, he hadn't charged it properly. The screen remained stubbornly black, a useless slab of plastic and glass. He tried the intercom button near the door, pressing it repeatedly, but there was no response, no crackle of static, no voice, just the dead, echoing silence. He stumbled towards the end of the carriage, his heart beginning to pound a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The connecting door, usually heavy and reluctant, slid open with an eerie, effortless glide. The next carriage was identical to his own, empty, silent, bathed in that dim, sickly light. He walked through it, then the next, and the next. Each one was a perfect, chilling replica, devoid of human presence, a ghost train gliding through a subterranean void. As he moved, a profound sense of isolation descended upon him. He was utterly alone, adrift in this metallic shell, hurtling through an unknown, unending darkness. He tried to rationalize it. A diversion, an emergency. But why no announcements? Why the complete absence of staff or other passengers? The questions circled in his mind, each one echoing back with only the terrifying answer of silence. He reached the driver's cab door, pulling at the handle, locked. He pounded on it, his fists making dull, muffled thuds against the reinforced metal. "Hello? Is anyone there?" His voice sounded thin, reedy, swallowed by the vast emptiness of the train. No answer. Not even a faint echo. It was as if the air itself absorbed the sound, refusing to carry it. Desperate, he pressed his face against the glass of the cab door, peering into the shadowy interior. The controls were dark, unlit. He couldn't make out a driver, a silhouette, anything. It was a phantom cockpit, operating itself. The train continued its smooth, inexorable journey, an unstoppable force propelled by an unseen hand. Time lost all meaning. Minutes bled into hours, hours into what felt like days. He sat back down in his original seat, exhausted, his mind racing through every conceivable scenario, each more terrifying than the last. Had he been kidnapped? Was this some elaborate prank? A dream? He pinched himself, hard, the sharp pain confirming reality. This was happening. He was awake, and he was trapped. He pressed his face against the window again, hoping for a flicker of light, a break in the monotonous concrete. Nothing. Just the blur, the endless gray. He felt a creeping claustrophobia, a sense of being buried alive in this metal coffin, moving endlessly towards a destination he couldn't fathom. The air grew stale, heavy, and a chill began to seep into the carriage, despite the lack of visible drafts. His thoughts turned to absurdities. Was he dead? Was this the afterlife, a transit point to somewhere else? The idea was almost comforting in its definitive horror, a structure to the madness. But his body still ached, his stomach still growled, his mind still screamed for escape. No, he was alive, and that was the problem. He must have drifted off again, a shallow, restless doze, because the next sensation that jolted him awake was a subtle change in the train's motion. The rhythmic vibration beneath him lessened, softened. The smooth glide began to decelerate, almost imperceptibly at first, then with a growing sense of purpose. A cold dread seeped into his bones, colder than the chill in the air. The endless tunnel was finally coming to an end. He pressed his face to the window, his eyes wide, straining against the perpetual gray. The concrete walls began to lighten, not with the warm glow of daylight, but with a faint, diffused illumination that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. The blur outside the window resolved into distinct panels, dark, uniform, unadorned. They passed a single, stark light fixture, then another, spaced out at unnerving intervals. The train slowed further, the last vestiges of its silent momentum fading. The light intensified, revealing more detail. A platform, stretching endlessly beside the tracks. It wasn't the brightly lit, bustling platform of any station, he knew. This platform was tiled, with large, square, dark gray slabs, featureless and desolate. There were no benches, no advertisements, no signs, no waste bins, no tracks leading anywhere else. Just the stark, geometric expanse. And then he saw them. Figures, standing at regular intervals along the length of the platform, perfectly still. They weren't waiting in the haphazard way people wait for a train. They stood with an unsettling uniformity, like statues carved from shadow. They were tall, impossibly slender, their forms indistinct, seeming to absorb the faint light rather than reflect it. He couldn't make out faces, or features, or even distinguishing clothing. They were simply dark shapes, almost two-dimensional against the dark tiles, yet undeniably three-dimensional in their presence. His breath hitched in his throat. He wanted to scream, to run, to pound on the windows, anything to break the spell of stillness that held him. But he was frozen, a deer caught in the headlights, his limbs heavy, unresponsive. His heart hammered a frantic drum against his ribs, a sound so loud in his own ears it almost drowned out the terrifying, profound silence of the approaching train. The train glided to a halt, a seamless, whisper-quiet cessation of movement. No squealing brakes, no final jolt. It simply stopped, perfectly aligned with the waiting figures. The last light fixture on the tunnel wall outside the window went out, plunging the world beyond the train into near darkness, save for the faint glow emanating from the platform itself. Then, with a soft, almost inaudible hiss, the doors to his carriage slid open. There was no sound from the figures, no movement. They remained perfectly still, waiting. It was an invitation, a silent command. He squeezed his eyes shut, wishing it was a nightmare, pleading with the universe for it to be a dream from which he could wake. When he opened them, the figures were still there, unmoving, patient. One by one, they began to step onto the platform. Their movements were fluid, unhurried, almost unnaturally smooth. They didn't walk so much as glide, their feet making no sound on the tiled surface. They filed into the train, a procession of shadows, filling the empty carriage with their silent, unsettling presence. They didn't look at him. They didn't acknowledge his existence. They simply moved, with a chilling deliberation, past his seat, towards the back of the carriage. And then, slowly, they began to take seats. Not just anywhere, but around him. A figure settled in the seat opposite him, its form a featureless void. Another took the seat behind him, and then another in front. Soon, he was encircled, hemmed in by these silent, unknowable entities. The carriage was no longer empty. It was filled, not with the warmth of human presence, but with a cold, suffocating dread. The faint light inside the train seemed to dim further, as if absorbed by their very essence. He could feel their presence, a chilling weight, even though they made no sound, no movement, offered no gesture. They simply sat, still and silent, like passengers waiting for the next leg of a journey. The doors hissed shut, sealing them all inside. The train remained motionless, bathed in the dim, jaundiced glow of the internal lights, surrounded by the profound, crushing silence. The figures did not stir. They did not breathe. They did not look at him. But he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to his very core, that they were waiting for the true, final destination. And he was now, irrevocably, on board. The hum of the fluorescent lights seemed to take on a deeper, more sinister tone, a prelude to a journey from which there would be no return. He was no longer just a passenger. He was part of the cargo, part of the silence, part of the unsettling void that had taken hold of this train, and would now, inevitably, take hold of him. And as he sat there, paralyzed by a terror so absolute it had stolen his voice, he felt the faintest tremor beneath him, a sign that the train, with its new, silent passengers, was about to depart. 9th story. The Borrower. It began subtly, as most terrors do, with a whisper of sensation, rather than a shout of pain. Elias first noticed it as a slight itch, a phantom irritation just between his shoulder blades. He reached, as one does, but the spot was just out of reach, nestled in that frustrating expanse of human anatomy that requires either contortion or assistance. He shrugged it off. Perhaps a stray hair, a wrinkle in his shirt. The next morning, shaving, he caught sight of something in the mirror. A tiny, perfect line, no bigger than a grain of rice, etched into the skin just below his left earlobe. It was thin, white, and looked like an old, healed wound. Yet he knew, with a certainty that chilled him, that it hadn't been there the day before. He prodded it, a faint puckering of the skin his only reward. No pain, no tenderness. It was as if it had always been there, a forgotten fragment of his personal history. But Elias remembered his skin. He remembered the moles, the freckles, the single birthmark on his wrist. He was meticulous, a creature of routine, and this mark was an intruder. He dismissed it. A scratch he hadn't noticed. Perhaps during a restless night, he'd clawed himself in his sleep. It seemed plausible enough, a mundane explanation for an anomaly. Yet a sliver of unease had been planted. The next morning, the unease blossomed into quiet dread. This time, the mark was on the back of his neck, just at the hairline. Another small, unblemished line, perhaps a millimeter in length, perfectly straight, almost surgical in its precision. He ran his fingers over it, feeling tiny ridge. Again, no pain, no redness, no sign of recent injury. It was already healed, absorbed into the landscape of his skin. He stripped his bed, examining the sheets for a drop of blood, a smudge, anything that would suggest a struggle or a fresh wound. Nothing. The sheets were pristine, the pillowcase unblemished. His pajamas, too, were clean, devoid of any tear or stain. It was as if these tiny alterations appeared out of thin air, fully formed and aged. A cold certainty began to settle upon him. These were not accidental scratches. These were deliberate, and they were happening while he slept. Sleep, once a sanctuary, transformed into an arena of silent terror. Each evening, as dusk bled into night, Elias felt a prickle of anticipation, a morbid curiosity mingled with profound fear. What would tomorrow bring? Where would the next mark appear? He tried sleeping on his back, then his stomach, then curled into a fetal position, as if his posture could somehow deter the unseen sculptor of his flesh. It made no difference. Days bled into weeks, each dawn revealing a new, minuscule addition to his growing collection of silent trophies. A tiny crescent on his inner thigh, barely visible. A faint, almost invisible dash on the sole of his foot. A pinprick dot near his navel. They were always small, always healed, always in places he couldn't easily reach or inspect without a mirror. They were also, he noted with a shudder, always on parts of his body that would be covered by clothes, making them easy to hide, easy to ignore for anyone but him. His obsession grew. He started keeping a journal, meticulously drawing each new scar, noting its exact location and dimension. He measured them with a tiny ruler, the kind jewelers use. He photographed them, though the camera struggled to pick up their delicate precision. His skin was becoming a map of some clandestine activity, a canvas silently altered by an unknown artist. He lost weight. His eyes grew hollow from lack of restful sleep, his mind a constant swirl of theories and frantic searches. Could it be a medical condition? A bizarre skin disorder? He consulted dermatologists, general practitioners, even a neurologist. None could offer an explanation beyond idiopathic scarring, or suggested he might be unconsciously self-harming in his sleep, a notion he vehemently rejected. The scars were too perfect, too clean, too inaccessible. One night, the fear became unbearable. He couldn't go on like this, waking up to new mutilations, his body slowly being remade without his consent, without his knowledge. He needed to see. He needed proof. He bought a motion-activated security camera, the kind people use to monitor their homes while away. He set it up discreetly in his bedroom, perched on a bookshelf, angled to capture his entire bed. He tested it, making sure the infrared night vision was clear, that the memory card was empty and ready. The red light of the recording indicator was a tiny, baleful eye in the darkness. That night, he prepared for sleep, as if for a surgical procedure. He showered, put on fresh, loose pajamas, and meticulously examined every inch of his skin, confirming that no new marks had yet appeared. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to remain still, trying to stay awake, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. But exhaustion, a relentless tide, eventually pulled him under. He awoke with a jolt, the morning light already filtering through the blinds. His first act was not to check his body, but to lunge for the camera. He ripped out the memory card, his fingers trembling, and rushed to his computer. The footage was a blur of his sleeping form, punctuated by occasional shifts and turns. He fast-forwarded through hours of placid slumber, his breath catching in his throat with every rustle of the sheets. He saw himself roll onto his side, then his back. He saw the subtle rise and fall of his chest. Nothing, just an ordinary man, deep in the unconscious grip of sleep. He was about to give up, despair creeping in, when something, a flicker, caught his eye. He rewound, slowed the playback to a crawl, frame by excruciating frame. It happened around 3:17 a.m. His body was perfectly still, lying on his stomach, face buried slightly in the pillow. The camera's night vision painted the scene in an eerie monochrome. He saw it then. Not a figure, not a shadow, but a subtle distortion in the air itself. It was as if the very light, the very particles of the room, shimmered, wavered, just above the small of his back. It was like heat haze, but cold, precise, contained. Then a glint. Tiny, almost imperceptible. He zoomed in, straining his eyes, pressing his face against the screen. It was like a needle, impossibly fine, reflecting the infrared light. It hovered, motionless, for a beat, then dipped. Not into his skin, but through it, as if his flesh offered no resistance. There was no visible incision, no blood, no pulling of the skin. The needle-like glint simply vanished into his back. He watched, horrified, as the unseen instrument moved with an agonizing slowness. It traced a microscopic line, a perfect straight path across his skin. He saw the air shimmer again, intensifying around the point of contact, a silent, invisible hum of activity. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the needle-like glint retracted, pulling away from his body. The distortion in the air faded, and the room was still once more. His sleeping form remained unmoving, undisturbed. Elias sat there, frozen, the mouse still clutched in his clammy hand. He rewound and replayed the segment dozens of times, each viewing confirming the impossible. It wasn't a person. It wasn't an insect. It was nothing he could comprehend, an entity or a force that could manipulate matter on a microscopic level, leaving no trace but the faint surgical scar. And the most terrifying part? He had felt nothing. No touch, no prick, no cold, no warmth. It had been utterly silent, utterly painless. He finally peeled his pajamas away from his back, rushing to the bathroom mirror. There, just where the shimmering air had been, was another tiny, perfectly straight line. He ran his finger over it. It was already healed, just like all the others. The footage confirmed his deepest fear, but offered no solace, no explanation. Who or what was doing this? Why? What was it taking? These weren't just scars. They were excisions, removals. What was being borrowed from his body, piece by infinitesimal piece? Was it skin? Cells? Something even more fundamental? Something he couldn't see or measure? The thought gnawed at him, more terrifying than any phantom assailant. If it was just skin, why take such tiny, insignificant amounts? Why not just flay him, if that were the goal? No, this was different. This was precise, almost ceremonial. A collection. He tried to go to the police, clutching his laptop like a lifeline, the footage playing on a loop. They listened, initially with polite concern, then with growing skepticism. When he showed them the video, their expressions shifted from sympathy to concern for his mental well-being. "Mr. Thorne," one officer said gently, "that's just static. Or maybe some dust motes reflecting the IR light. Your mind is playing tricks on you. You're clearly under a lot of stress." They suggested therapy. He left, humiliated and alone, his truth dismissed as delusion. He stopped going to work. The thought of being among people, of feeling their casual glances, made him sick. He imagined them unknowingly brushing against his altered skin, against the tiny, secret maps of his nightly invasion. His apartment became his fortress, then his prison. He drew the blinds, turning his living space into a perpetual twilight. He ate sparingly, the taste of food like ash in his mouth. He kept the camera running every night, hoping to see more, hoping for a clearer picture, a revelation that would explain the inexplicable. He saw the shimmer again, many times, always in a different spot, always followed by the impossibly fine glint of the needle. It was relentless, methodical, a dot on his eyelid, a microscopic line on his earlobe, a tiny crosshatch on his ankle. He began to feel lighter, not physically, but something more profound, a sense of diminishment. He looked at his hands, his arms, his legs. They were still his, outwardly. But he knew, with a horrifying certainty, that they were subtly less. Less of him, perhaps. Less material. Less essence. His reflection became a stranger. His eyes, once bright and curious, were now haunted, wide with a perpetual silent scream. He felt a coldness radiating from within, as if the borrowed pieces of him were taking something vital, something warm and human. One night, he had a dream. He was floating in an infinite blackness, and around him, suspended in the void, were countless tiny, glowing fragments. They pulsed with a faint, internal light, and he knew, instinctively, that each one was a piece of him, a minuscule shard of skin, a speck of bone dust, a single cell, all drifting in an ocean of nothingness, part of a vast, unseeable collection. And then, a colossal, unseen presence, larger than any star, began to draw them in, slowly, inexorably, into its own vast, silent being. He awoke in a cold sweat, the dream lingering like a physical touch. He knew then, with a terrible, absolute clarity, that this was not a predator, not a malicious entity seeking to harm him. This was something else entirely, a collector, a curator of the infinitesimal, and he was merely a source, an unconsenting donor in a cosmic exchange he could not comprehend. The scars continued to accumulate, a silent testament to his nightly divestment. He sometimes traced them with his fingertips, feeling the subtle, raised lines, each one a memory of an unseen touch, a quiet theft. He was becoming a mosaic of borrowed parts, a living tapestry woven with threads of his own diminishing substance. He never showed the footage to anyone again. What was the point? They wouldn't believe him. They couldn't. How could they comprehend something that existed beyond the realm of their senses? Something that worked with such surgical precision, such quiet persistence. Elias learned to live with it, or rather, to exist alongside it. He knew that every time he closed his eyes, every time he drifted into the vulnerable abyss of sleep, another piece of him would be taken. It was an unspoken contract, a nightly toll. He didn't know what the borrower was, or why it needed these fragments. He only knew that it was always there, waiting for the cover of darkness, for the quiet surrender of consciousness. And sometimes, in the darkest hours before dawn, when the house was utterly silent, and the red eye of the camera recorded his motionless form, Elias would imagine the vast, silent entity somewhere beyond his comprehension, meticulously adding his latest contribution to its unimaginable collection. And he would wonder, with a chill that permeated his very bones, when or if it would ever have enough. The thought was not just terrifying, but profoundly, chillingly, lonely. He was being disassembled, bit by bit, by something that didn't hate him, didn't even acknowledge him, but simply needed what he had, and it would take it, night after night, until there was nothing left to borrow. The silence of the house, once comforting, now echoed with the silent, unseen hum of the borrower's work, a lullaby of slow, inevitable consumption. And Elias, awake in the darkness, knew he was merely waiting for the final, silent transaction. The story delves into the unsettling experience of Elias and his silent, nightly ordeal. It focuses on the psychological horror and the unknown, aiming for a tone that is both literary and accessible, suitable for a sleep story format. I have expanded on the protagonist's internal struggle, the details of his discovery, the lack of external validation, and the chilling implications of the borrowing to meet the requested length. 10th story, The Painted Smile. In the sprawling heart of the city, amidst the ceaseless murmur of 1,000 lives intertwined, stood the grand piazza. It was a place where pigeons waddled with audacious impunity, where children chased ephemeral bubbles, and where the scent of roasted chestnuts mingled with the exhaust fumes of passing trams. And in the very center of this vibrant, breathing organism, a figure often held court, a silent maestro of the human condition, known simply as the mime. He was an anomaly, even among the diverse tapestry of the city's street performers. His stage was an invisible circle, chalked by habit and reputation. His props were the air itself, and his only costume was the classic monochrome: stark white face paint, jet black suit, and a pair of white gloves that seemed to accentuate every graceful, deliberate gesture. But it was his smile that truly captivated, and in time, unsettled every soul who paused to watch him. The smile was not merely painted on, it was sculpted, a masterwork of artistry and an uncanny triumph of endurance. A wide, joyous curve reaching from one cheekbone to the other, lifting the corners of his eyes into perpetual crinkles of mirth. It was a smile that promised boundless delight, a perfect, unwavering emblem of happiness. Tourists loved him for it, snapping photographs, leaving generous tips. Locals admired his dedication, his almost preternatural ability to hold that precise, beatific expression for hours on end, without so much as a twitch or a tremor. Other performers, weary after an hour of their own acts, would watch in quiet awe as the mime performed from dawn till dusk, his painted smile remaining utterly, perfectly fixed. There was no flinching, no adjustment, no easing of the facial muscles, not even the subtle, imperceptible shifts that betray human fatigue or momentary distraction. It was a smile carved from stone, animated by something beyond simple muscle memory. Arthur Finch, a local journalist with a penchant for human interest pieces, had observed the mime for weeks from the window of his favorite coffee shop. He was fascinated, not by the mime's elegant pantomimes, but by the relentless, unyielding optimism of that painted grin. It seemed impossible. Every human face, even those of the most practiced actors, revealed micro-expressions, tiny tells of inner thought or physical strain. But the mime's face was a mask of unblemished, blissful joy. Arthur, a man who prided himself on uncovering the hidden currents beneath the superficial froth of daily life, felt a professional itch. This wasn't just a street performer. This was a phenomenon. He decided to do a feature piece, a deep dive into the discipline and psychology behind the unbreaking smile. His initial approach was conventional. He tried to speak to the mime after a performance. As the last coins clinked into his hat, the mime would simply nod, a slight, graceful bow, then slowly, deliberately begin to pack his few simple props. Arthur would approach, notebook in hand, a prepared list of innocuous questions. Each time, the mime would listen, his head cocked slightly, his painted smile serene and attentive. But he would never speak. He would simply offer a slight gesture, a polite wave of a white-gloved hand, indicating a gentle refusal. before turning and gliding away, disappearing into the pedestrian flow like a ghost. Arthur was intrigued, then a little frustrated. A silent subject made for a challenging interview. But the silence only deepened the mystery, adding another layer to the enigma of the unwavering smile. He resolved to try a different journalistic approach. Observation. He would follow the mime. Not in a stalkerish, intrusive way, he rationalized, but in the spirit of immersive reporting, documenting a day in the life of this peculiar, captivating figure. The next morning, Arthur was at the piazza, even before the mime arrived. He watched as the figure emerged from a side street, not yet in costume, dressed in simple, nondescript clothes. Even then, something was off. As the mime walked, his posture was unnaturally upright, almost stiff, and his gait was measured, too precise for a casual stroll. And his face, even without the white paint, the muscles around his mouth seemed to be held in an odd, taut configuration. Arthur dismissed it as his own imagination, a trick of expectation. Once the costume was donned and the white makeup applied, along with the vivid, red-painted smile, all prior observations were swallowed by the blinding, unyielding perfection of the performer's persona. He watched the mime perform for hours. The sun arced across the sky, painting the piazza in shifting shades of gold and amber. The mime mimed pulling invisible ropes, climbing imaginary ladders, trapping himself in soundless boxes. Each movement was fluid, expressive, but his face remained a constant, joyful beacon. Arthur noted the way children laughed, how lovers leaned into each other, captivated by the silent narrative. He also noticed the subtle, almost imperceptible way some people, after an initial burst of amusement, would drift away, a faint unease flickering in their eyes. It was the smile, Arthur realized, the unblinking, unwavering smile. It wasn't natural. It was too perfect. As dusk began to bleed into the city sky, painting the clouds in bruised purples and fiery oranges, the mime concluded his performance. He bowed, gathered his hat with a silent thank you to the few lingering admirers, and then, with the same deliberate movements, began to shed his visible persona. The black jacket came off, folded meticulously. The white gloves were removed and tucked away. His ordinary shoes replaced the polished, silent ones he used for his act. But the face, Arthur observed with a tightening in his chest, remained untouched. The white paint, the jet-black eyes, and, most disturbingly, the wide, red, joyous smile were still there, as pristine and fixed as they had been at dawn. Arthur, now fueled by a growing sense of dread, followed him. The mime walked with the same precise, almost gliding motion through the bustling streets. He didn't hurry, didn't seem to notice the shifting crowds or the blare of car horns. His painted smile shone out, a stark, surreal beacon in the twilight. People stared, some whispered, children pointed. Yet the mime walked on, oblivious, or perhaps simply unmoved. The journalist, carefully maintaining a discreet distance, felt a cold knot forming in his stomach. This wasn't a performance anymore. This was something else. The mime made a brief stop at a small grocery store. Arthur watched through the storefront window, a morbid fascination overriding his journalistic detachment. The mime moved with the same uncanny grace, picking up a few items, a loaf of bread, some cheese, a bottle of water. He approached the counter. The cashier, a young woman with tired eyes, seemed taken aback by the sight of him. She fumbled with the items, her gaze darting to the painted smile that seemed to radiate an almost aggressive cheerfulness. The mime offered no word, only gestured subtly to a bill in his hand. The transaction was completed in silence. The smile, Arthur noted, did not waver, not a millimeter. It was a fixed, unblinking mask of unadulterated happiness, applied to an otherwise mundane act. The bread was placed in a bag, the change was accepted, and the mime simply turned and glided out of the store, the smile still stretching across his face, as if mocking the banality of the transaction. Arthur followed him through winding side streets, the city lights beginning to bloom like artificial stars. The mime eventually stopped before a modest, unassuming apartment building, its windows dark, save for a faint spill of light from a hallway. He produced a key, let himself in, and the heavy door clicked shut behind him, leaving Arthur standing on the quiet street, a chill seeping into his bones that had nothing to do with the evening air. He found a discreet spot across the street, partially hidden by a thick oak tree, from where he could observe the mime's apartment window. The blinds were drawn, but a crack of light at the bottom suggested activity within. Arthur settled in, his initial curiosity now mutated into a morbid, unsettling determination. He needed to see this man unmask, to see the true face beneath the painted joy. He needed to understand how a human being could maintain such an artificial expression for so long, even in privacy. Minutes stretched into an hour, then two. The city's hum began to fade, replaced by the occasional distant siren or the murmur of late-night pedestrians. Then a light flickered on in the mime's window. It was dim, yellowish, casting long, wavering shadows. Arthur strained his eyes, peering through the gap in the blinds. He saw the mime moving inside, a silent shadow against the faint light. He moved slowly, deliberately, the way he moved in the piazza. He put away his groceries. He went into what appeared to be a small kitchen. Arthur watched as he prepared a simple meal. He buttered his bread, cut his cheese, and as he ate, sitting alone at a small table, the light from a single bulb casting a harsh glow on his face, Arthur saw it, the painted smile. It was still there, unchanged, unwavering. The wide, joyful grin stretched across his face as he chewed, as he swallowed, as he brought the glass of water to his lips. It was impossible. A person's face relaxed when they ate, when they were alone. Yet, the mime's face remained a fixed, unsettling tableau of unadulterated bliss. Arthur felt a tremor run through him, a cold dread that seeped into his bones. This wasn't a trick of light or an illusion. This was real. The journalist's mind, trained to seek logical explanations, was reeling. Was it a mask? No. He'd seen the mime rub his face, seen him wipe away a speck of dust near his eye. It was paint on skin. Was it a medical condition? Some kind of muscular paralysis? But the mime's movements were fluid, graceful. His eyes, though unblinking for long stretches, moved, followed objects, held focus. It defied every rational explanation. The smile was not just painted on, it was somehow, impossibly, part of him, even when he was alone, going about the most mundane of tasks. Hours crept by. The last vestiges of city noise died down. The street became utterly silent, save for the whisper of the wind through the oak leaves. Arthur, despite the growing chill and the gnawing unease, could not bring himself to leave. He was trapped, bound by a terrifying fascination to witness the conclusion of this surreal day. He needed to see the mime sleep, to see the smile Finally, drop away. Surely, it had to. No human could maintain such a strenuous expression, even in unconsciousness. The light in the mime's apartment remained on. Arthur shivered, pulling his jacket tighter. He watched as the mime, after eating, simply sat at his small table, utterly motionless, facing the wall. No book, no phone, no television. Just stillness. And the smile. Always the smile. Just before the first faint hint of pre-dawn gray touched the eastern sky, the light in the mime's window extinguished. Darkness swallowed the room. Arthur, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs, waited. A moment of intense anticipation. Would he hear movement? A sigh of relief? The rustle of clothes as the mime prepared for bed? Nothing. Only silence. Arthur, his breath catching in his throat, slowly, carefully, rose from his hiding spot. He crept across the street, his footsteps unnaturally loud in the profound stillness of the hour. He moved closer to the window, pressing himself against the cool brick of the building next door, trying to see anything through the glass, now reflecting only the faint, nascent light of the approaching dawn. He held his breath, straining to penetrate the gloom inside. It took a moment for his eyes to adjust, for a shape to coalesce from the indistinct shadows, and then he saw it. In the center of the dark room, facing the far wall, stood the mime, utterly still, motionless. And even in the almost total darkness, where features should have been swallowed by the night, Arthur could still perceive it. The painted smile. It was there, etched onto his face, visible even in the dimness, a pale, unwavering slash of red against the white, radiating a chilling, pervasive joy. It was not a trick of the light. It was simply there, perfect, fixed, unmoving, as if carved directly into his very being. Arthur didn't wait to see if the sun would rise, or if the mime would ever move from his silent vigil. A guttural gasp escaped his throat, and he turned, stumbling away from the building, running blindly through the deserted streets. The image of that unchanging, painted smile burned into his mind like a brand. He ran until his lungs ached, until the cold fear began to recede, replaced by a deep, gnawing horror. He never wrote the feature piece. He never approached the mime again. But sometimes, in the dead of night, when the city was quiet and the world outside his window was dark, Arthur would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, haunted by the memory of a painted smile. And he would wonder, was it a mask that had melded with the flesh beneath? Or was it something far more ancient, far more unsettling? An entity that had merely chosen a human form and decided to wear a smile that would never, ever fade. The mime still performs in the grand piazza, a silent fixture of joy amidst the city's chaos. And if you ever find yourself there, perhaps you'll see him, his painted smile wide and inviting. But look closely, for that smile holds a secret, a chilling stillness that hints at something far more profound than mere performance, something that will linger in the quiet corners of your mind, long after you've left the bright lights of the piazza behind. The last story has been told. The silence is returning to claim the room. For those of you who are still awake, still floating here with me in the dark, I'm curious. Which of tonight's tales will linger with you the longest? Let me know in the comments. Your thoughts are always a welcome light in the darkness. Until next time, I wish you a deep and dreamless sleep. Or perhaps not.